I miss oh boy, what was it? Car Talk. I don't know why I had a hard time pulling it up.
Oh man,
I was going to
best.
attempt a bit of slapstick humor from those guys, but
yes.
like, oh, they'd hate to be on air with us, but anyway.
Yeah. You've wasted
a
perfectly good hour.
They've wasted a perfectly good 3.5 hours.
Oh my gosh! Holy crap!
With us at this point. Yeah,
oh,
this one's been a doozy. So.
Welcome back to the Aviation RC Noobs Podcast. You found us. My name is Matt.
And I'm Joe.
We're here to be with you in your adventure to RC airborne proficiency. So buckle in, let's take off. All right, we're here with episode 5, Motors and ESCs. We're going to try to cover the powertrain of your airplane system as best we can. Before we do that, we're going to hop over and talk about what we've been busy with. It has been a little while since we recorded the last episode. It's been almost a month, but it's also been a time of unprecedented turmoil in the country in a bunch of different ways. COVID-19 being probably the primary piece here, and we're kind of recording this just at the tail end of the Minnesota riots here in America, and all the fallout from that in here. So, yeah, it's been a while. So it's been almost a month and a half.
We could say that. In reality, I think the last episode was recorded in February. So
okay, so shame on us, and we're sorry. We're gonna start there. Maybe we should just say sorry. It's episode 5, Motors and ESCs. Anyway, no, but but we've had plenty of time to do a bunch of things, but the world has also been topsy-turvy. Like everybody else in the world, pretty much, we've been generally asked to stay home. So I think last time we suggested everybody pull out their X-Acto knives, and if you can get out to a Dollar Tree, grab as much foam or building supplies as you can, and see what you can build. And I know Joe got busy with some things. I was finishing up the Build-A-Roy Challenge. I think it just finished. And I was moving into the next challenge, which we'll talk about in a second. Joe, why don't you tell us what you did?
So I had a lot of time on my hands over the past couple months. I am fortunate enough that I work in a position that my work was able to be done from home. It was not my normal work. Yeah, I moved into more of a support role for the people that I work with and for, but there was still work to be done. A lot of phone calls, a lot of emails. So that said, 2.5 months that I was home went by really fast. So I couldn't tell you where the time went, and I did not spend nearly as much time with the hobby as I had hoped or should have. It was there's a lot of working from home and just enjoying being home. Enjoying time enjoying time with my wife, and she's got her office set up, I've got my office set up. We weren't hanging together constantly, but I'd go in there two or three times throughout the day, check in with her, spend a few minutes with her, and I'd get up and move about. But no, I did not build or do anything with the hobby nearly as much as I should have or wanted to. But on the front end of all this, I was able to do some stuff. The Fogey, which would be the last plane that I had that we really talked about, I can say is gone, and I can get into that. But the Fogey is no more. In as much as it is a couple pieces of foam in my garage right now. But
It was
before all
always
that,
a couple pieces of foam.
you're right. But before all that happened, towards the front end of the COVID lockdowns, my in-laws came down for the weekend, and my mother-in-law works in, or works with STEM, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics in North Carolina. And so I had the opportunity to first take my father-in-law out flying with a Fogey, and then it piqued his interest. Like, man, she would love to see this because she works with STEM and all that. This could be a great tool with them. And so
Right, her eyes lit up like mine did when I started seeing this for the same reason. Just going like, wow, this is a great educational tool that's guaranteed to spark interest in a lot more youth than a lot of other methods.
yeah, his eyes certainly did. And I guess her eyes lit up as much as her eyes do. So I took her out the next day.
Pretty even keel.
Yeah, she's just, I don't know that I've ever seen her like super excitable.
Right.
In the few years that I've known her. I mean, wonderful lady. I just, in some ways, a bit like me, just even, calm. But I did get a chance. I got to take the father-in-law out, then I took her out, and I couldn't get either one of them to take the controller from me. And both of them were, we just don't want to wreck your stuff. And I'm like,
yeah, but Joe,
we're looking
if
at
you hadn't
$2
had
in foam.
But if you hadn't had 40 hours of, or however much it was, like a month's time in the simulator, if I had handed you, said, hey man, you should fly this, because I kind of did, right?
Yeah.
Or I tried to. If you hadn't had that time, what would you have said? Oh, hell no, right? Oh, no, I'm not going to bust your stuff.
Yeah, potentially. But at the same time, it's what I was trying to communicate, that it's fine. And you might tank it. Chances are you won't. I've got it trimmed out. It's not going anywhere unless you tell it to go there. But
right, when you let go of this, it's just going to keep going. That's all. It's not going to crash. It's just going to keep floating.
Yeah. So anyway, I couldn't get either one of them to fly, but they were both interested in it. And since my father-in-law has ordered in 2 kits from Flight Test store. He ordered in the Simple Cub, and then he ordered in, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, it was one of the master builds. So
let's see, Corsair, Spitfire, Mustang, P-38.
It might have been the Corsair.
I think there's another.
Yeah, I think it might have been the Corsair.
A lot of people, the Corsair is so popular. It's just a cool looking plane. It always has been, always will be.
It is, but he's a little ways from being ready to tackle that one. That said, he might tackle it as a, just a project to build in the basement. I think he might be more interested in the building side of things than the actual flying side of things.
Sure, in the build part of the hobby.
Yeah, and it's a little tough for him right now. He's actually, for several months now, been for a few years, but especially the last couple months, been in some pretty heavy pain. He's having some back issues that, with all the COVID stuff going on, kind of put a damper on him trying to get the surgery that he needs. But hopefully he'll be able to get that soon, and then he'll be able to spend more time sitting. But they ordered those kits to see what the process was. Like, if you bought a kit with everything done up, ready to go, what was the build process?
What does it take? Yeah,
right.
And of course you're sitting there going like, this was really simple. I mean,
yes and no.
Like, it took time. But it wasn't hard to follow. It was pretty easy to do, but it does take some expertise to get it just right.
Yeah, so we sat on their balcony porch, or screened in porch. My father-in-law, my brother-in-law, and I sat there, had the laptop pulled out, watching the build video on it. And we were taking a little bit by little bit, and I was kind of going over build concepts with them, and here's how you cut this part out, or of course there were pieces that popped out, but here's how you got to do your your hinge cuts and the this cut and the this fold, that
Hey,
fold, and
did you turn into me just for that moment? Were you?
just a little bit, maybe,
Yeah.
maybe. Especially if
At
we
least you
want.
know how I got there.
Yeah. So that got built. We did maiden it. It didn't maiden well. There were some various issues with that don't necessarily belong in this part of the conversation, but yeah. So they're trying that out. It's not the right time, I don't think, for them to really pursue that with things going on. But I'm curious to see where that goes in the future. The a flying story with that aspect or with that topic. When I took my mother-in-law out, and I tried to get her to fly, and she had no interest in taking that controller from me for the same reason my father-in-law did, which was, I don't want to crash your planes. I don't want to lose your plane to this, that. Well, yeah, you're not going to lose it. If it gets that far away, I'll bring it back in. And you're probably not going to crash it. And if you did, I'm out $3 in foam. You know, they're just, oh, but the time.
Right.
I said, the time
and maybe
is...
a prep.
Yeah, but it's fine.
It's not like a balsa build where you're at it for about a month to get it right, or even a couple weeks, right? Like some of them you can actually go pretty fast with. But the point is yeah, within a night you could probably have it up and running again.
Yeah. So anyway, but while I was out flying it, the day that I took my mother-in-law out, especially that time of day, was very windy. You know how normally you're like, wow, it's windy and there's trees, you know, kind of encompassing this area. So there's a lot of ground noise as far as the turbulence goes. You're like, let me get up above the trees and I'll get some clean air. And trees are speed breaks. We'll just we'll throw that one out there because I got that fogey up there and said I'm gonna let it fly that way for a little while. It went that way and it went quick. And then I turned it around to bring it back.
So then you turned it. So basically, you're going downwind for a little while, and it was trucking, and then you started to turn it back, and you're like, "Oh, all I got to do is just bring it." Oh God, it's not going anywhere, is it?
Yeah, it's taking forever. I was like, I'm gonna be screwed if my battery goes dead while it's out there.
Yeah.
What was probably 2 minutes of flight time in that direction was almost 10 minutes of flight back.
I'll tell you what, it's a good thing it's an old fogey. Because most planes don't have that kind of battery life. They're not that efficient. Because the old fogey's so light, compared to its size, that it's just you can fly it for a long time.
Well, and on that point too, with it being so light, but perhaps a different plane would have gotten back faster. Part of the problem that I was running into with the fogey is the nature of that plane. Love the plane for it, but the undercambered wing,
it's slow.
It's slow, but it generates a ton of lift. So I had it trimmed proper for the speed I was going, but it was also catching a tremendous headwind. So anytime that I tried to, because I was bringing it back on the same throttle that I took it out there, I was like, man, this is taking forever. Let me rev it up. And any amount of throttle that I wanted to give it beyond what I had it at, of course, the way trim works, it wanted to whoop, nose up, and I was fighting that, and then of course it dawned on me, well, yeah, the wind's blowing past it, but I'm losing ground if I don't keep that nose level, because the moment it noses up, it's going to grab all that air, and it might not stall out, but it's flying backwards, baby.
Right, it's going to become a kite without a string.
So the flight back went a lot faster once I just said screw it and took it to about like 80-85% throttle and just held the nose down, which then I ran. Fortunately, I didn't have ailerons in that build because it's very difficult to keep that nose down without giving any side to side. So that rudder was kicking in a bit. But it took a little while, but I eventually got it back. It was a long flight back.
Oh, I'm glad you got it back too. There's been a couple guys who are like, "Oh, this is cool. I'm going to be able to." Oh crap! I don't know. I'm going to get it back. I've had a couple planes I just had to ditch because I could tell they were not coming back. The longer I had them in the air, the further out they were getting, and I'm like, "Oh crap!" And it was one like an old fogey where it's just a strong headwind. You've seen my flying field Oh, maybe you haven't. It's just a big 40-acre open field. So when it's windy, like it's windy in a normal yard or something, right? It's almost, an extra 10 miles an hour there, and
Oh
it's
yeah, it's almost like
unbroken. So
lake wind.
it's just going, baby. And
Hmm.
yeah, so it's going to takes those planes and just keeps them going if you aren't careful. Anyway.
Yeah.
So okay,
So
so you managed to get it back though. That's the cool part.
yeah, I got it back. To date, I have not lost one.
S-
It
Sweating it.
may not have continued flying once I put it on the ground, but I have not lost one. What actually killed that fogey, I took it out flying behind my church, and again, this was early in things shutting down.
Hmm.
And they got a little field out behind the church, small, but I went
Right.
out there, and I thought I was going to lose it in the trees around that field because I got it up above the trees I was flying in around, and I guess it started getting gusty. I had a real hard time keeping it under control because I was trying to bring it back in, but it just kept wanting to nose up, potentially from headwind and just the throttle. Because I'd flown it
Hmm.
around for a good little while, and then I started getting, okay, I'm comfortable. I'm going to get a little fancier with it, and that's when you start getting in trouble. And like it was up there doing backflips, big old
Yeah.
backflips, and I'm just trying to get it back,
Oh
under
yeah. So you had a
control.
more two tail heavy for the headwind that you had.
Right, and it was not a tail heavy plane. Just that's what it was doing, and I don't know.
But that
Maybe
one's
the
that
battery
one's
shifted.
naturally set.
I don't think it did, but anyway,
Yeah,
so it was up
maybe.
there. It was up there cutting big old back loops, and I'd see it at kind of the peak of the loop when it's belly up. I'd see it up
Oh,
above
so
the
it was
trees.
over the trees?
Oh yeah, I was over
Oh,
there.
oh
Like
no. So you're
it's sitting
sitting
there.
there like, I don't know where it is. Oh, there it
Oh,
is.
there it is. Oh,
I don't
there.
know where it is.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, she must have been sweating
Trying to
bullets.
bring it back in, and I just knew I was going to lose it there, and I was like, "Oh man,
Hmm.
I don't care about the foam, man. I'm worried about all the electronics in it." But
I know, right?
I managed to get it back, and I was like, "Man, okay, cool." And so I brought it back in, I set it down, landed it, checked it over. Why was that happening? Everything checked out fine. It must have been the wind. You're a little shaky in that moment, and I said, "I really should just pack it up and go home."
One more go.
But I'm not going to leave the field with post almost emergency jitters. Like I'm not gonna have that weigh in on me. I'm enjoying the relief. I feel better. It's on the ground.
You're
It's safe. I'm gonna fly it. And so I flew it, and it flew fine. And then again, you try to get fancy, and something happens. And my intent was I wanted a sliding landing. I wanted to land it and have it skid across the ground a little ways, and it wasn't going to do that in the grass. So I was going to try to land it on the parking lot.
Right, that's right, because your landing gear is not functional
Right.
at this
So
point,
it's
right?
just the belly of
Yeah,
the plane.
I
So
got
I
you.
was going to land it in the parking lot so it could skid. I think the parking lot. I think this was after the parking lot was repaved
All right,
because
boy.
that parking lot was repaved recently. Anyway, but I wanted to get a nice. I cut the throttle. It plops and it slides. And I was bringing it around, and there's some trees in the parking barrier medians. Anyway, and I was bringing it around trying to set up for the landing, and I cut too close to a tree on the backside. You kind of have a hard time sometimes gauging how far away it is behind another object. And the
Yeah.
tree's bare, and I could see the plane, but I thought I was further away. Straight into the tree, and it was about 12 foot up. I mean, way out of my reach. It's church is shut down. There's nobody there. I kind of went around looking. There was no like brake I could stick up there.
Right.
And it was
There's
out by
no like
the
ladder hanging out that you could kind of
yeah.
use temporarily or anything.
Yeah, no,
Shoot.
I'm not. I don't have my truck anymore, so I couldn't get up in the bed of the truck. So
So
the only
what did
thing
you end up throwing at it? A bunch
a
of shoes?
basketball, because that where I was flying was out behind the student ministries building, and
Yeah.
they keep basketballs and soccer balls out there. So
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
I just started chucking a basketball at it for a while. It took me a while, but I finally knocked it out. But by the time I got it out of that tree, she won't going back in the air.
Well, at least
Um,
you didn't try to to take like a 6-foot piece of timber and throw it up as hard as you could at the plane that was in the tree, this little tiny plane.
Who did that?
Last time I did. Last time I think when I had flown the Hexie or something, another one of those when I was trying to get those in the air,
Uh-huh.
I crashed it into a tree and it was like 20 feet up, stuck on a branch. Like because it's literally a series of loops. That's all it
Yeah.
is with like
And
little
if it
winglets.
happens to slide down a branch.
And that's essentially what it did. And I was like, son of a, and at that point I was so frustrated with the whole day. It was a bad day of flying, right? So I grabbed this log. This is what I described last time. Like I grabbed this log and I hurled it at the next man. That thing that got crushed pretty bad. I mean, it held up well considering.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, it's like throwing a bowling ball at a foam plane. Like, okay, yeah, that's not going to make it, but I'll get the electronics back.
I mean, that's the important part, really. The
Right.
rest of it's
Those are
just
the
time.
things that take time. Yeah, well, I mean, but it's not a month's time to rebuild that plane unless you want it to be. Whereas it's a guaranteed month or more to get the electronics replaced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you don't have spares, So good, you got it back.
Yeah, it's back.
A bit battered.
It's in the garage. Everything's been ripped out of it. The only thing left that's not foam is some coffee stirrers I was using to guide the control wires and the control wires. Like,
Yep.
it's gutted at this point.
Oh.
But you know what? I was happy with that plane. And honestly, having built the Simple Cub and flown the Simple Cub,
right? Because that's what your father-in-law.
Right. He got the Cub. And I hear that it's like the recommended, like it's one of those top recommended as far as like getting into the hobby and having a plane that handles well and flies well. And
people love the Cub. They just love it.
I'm gonna have to build one. Like I'm gonna have to build one again because when I built that one, we ran into some issues of, I wanted to put ailerons in the build, go ahead and make it a 4-channel. I should have just stuck with a 3, especially because, but I decided, like I said, I want to go ahead and cut the ailerons in, get you flying on a 4-channel. And so we did that. There was some, I didn't get
a lot of people recommend it.
I didn't get the control wires long enough, so the ailerons were a little off, and I did some tweaking and working with those, and didn't quite get them right. But I was like, we've been going at it for 8 hours. Like, let's just. And so there could have been some issues there. I thought the CG was fine, but yeah, I'm fairly certain the CG was fine.
Dude, okay, so in the future, when you do this with your father-in-law next time, or should you, and you're not sure about something, give me a call, man.
I'm gonna have to.
You could just put it on the points, put it on your fingers. Let me see. Okay, yep, that looks good. Or nope, move it up a hair. You want a little bit more nose heavy, especially with the Cub. If I understand it right, the Cub needs a little bit more forward heavy. Plus, another aspect of that plane is if you do the full throws, it flies horrible because it's just too much. It needs smaller endpoints. So instead of moving like, let's say, a total of an inch, it really only needs like 1/2-inch movements or 1/4-inch movements to be a gentle flyer like it can be. And I say that's experience. So I ended up building the Simple Cub. I have it in the other room, and I brought it to the Simple Cub day at my field, and it was a handful. I was proud of it, man. It was beautiful. I had my little Uncle George little thing. I put his little mug in there and the cockpit looking thing. It looked great. So I'm flying it, and it's a handful. And I'm like, dude, this sucks. Everybody tells me Cubs are amazing. I'm watching these guys fly their Cubs. They're great. I said, can you help? I asked one of the old guys. I think it was the president of the club. I'm like, do you think you could help me with this? Like, I don't understand how to get this to work right. I think I built the plane right. I think the surfaces and controls they're all working right. I've got them centered enough where I should be able to fly this pretty well. What am I missing? And so what he ended up doing is he ended up setting, like you had, the 3 different modes in the controller, and 3 different throws, basically. So a high, middle, and low throw rate. And he also ended up putting in. I had the Expo backwards. So Expo is kind of like a softening of the travel. So instead of being a linear travel, it's a parabolic travel. So it goes slow at first and then it speeds up to the end,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it means that you have fine control in the middle quarter of the stick or the middle half of the stick, and on the outside it travels a lot more, right?
Right.
Because most of the time you're going to need fine controls to really do most of the maneuvering you want. But boy, oh boy, every once in a while you're about to hit a tree, I got to turn, I got to turn hard, and I got to turn quick. Well, you need the full, the full throw, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part, most of your travels are just going to be in that little centerpiece. If you did it linear, that little centerpiece would be I don't even like a tiny button, right? As
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like a quarter, you know? Like if you do the expo, you have a quarters range to move within. So anyway, I had it backwards. So it was traveling fast in the center, and then it was going real slow on the outer pieces of the throws. So it was zooming through neutral. So when I had it neutral, it was good at neutral. But if I moved that stick a tiny bit, it would go to like half throw. Which, again, so what I ended up realizing is I had that stuff all wrong. He set that up for me and he said, yeah, we're going to start in middle. And I'm going to fly it around, make sure it's trimmed out. And he said it didn't need much to trim it out. So that means I had built it about right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he handed it back to me and he goes, here you go, man. And so I took off. I'm like, holy crap, I can fly this. It flies great. Everybody was right.
Yeah.
But it came down to it was the throws. It was the high and low and making sure that they weren't moving too much. So if you're a noob and you've got one of those FT kits, all I can say is that when you're at the end and you built it and you're pretty sure you did it right, pay attention to those throw gauges that they have. And make sure you set up your transmitter. If you don't know, ask. Go on the forum, the FT forums or RC groups or whoever, and
Mm-hmm.
eat crow if you have to, because some places they're gonna go, "What do you mean you don't know nothing?" And you'd be like, "You're right, I don't know anything. That's why I'm asking." Or look online, look on YouTube. They'll show you how to kind of go through the steps to get that set up in your transmitter, so that because that's going to give you success.
Yeah.
And once you have a one model set up like that, you can probably put like 3 or 4 planes set up in that same setup.
So
Um,
yeah, and there are videos out there. I've looked them up, and every transmitter is a little different.
it is.
He's using the DX6,
Mm-hmm.
6 or
6E.
6E. It's
It's
the
probably the
it's the
6E.
lower end version of it.
Well,
Um,
the 6 is the lower end of that group. And
okay.
I don't know if the E is the extended version and the other
Well,
one is without the E is just basic. But
yeah, I think without the E's the basic because it's a 6 channel. It's the DX6, but
that's okay. That's all you
um,
really need for most of your
that's
planes.
that's all he needs. And in fact, I had to reverse one of the servos for
Mm-hmm.
one of the channels because of how I mounted the servo, and that was
Mm-hmm.
interesting. I was like, oh man, can this controller do that? And I looked into yeah, it can.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a weird. Like it's all in the sticks. You got to push them a certain way and then turn it on, and then you got to use one stick to like turn and select.
To do
and
the selections, yeah.
it flashes lights to tell you where you're at.
Oh boy, yeah.
I enjoy my
That's the
Turnigy.
old fashioned. That's the old fashioned way of doing it too.
Yeah. So
Nowadays, most of them do it like your Turnigy or uh, in the sense that it's all in the menu system
hmm
in the screen and
but
it's not in stick movements. But it used to be okay, both sticks to the lower right or lower left, and then that starts the selection menu for in or out. And you can actually, a lot of ESCs still do some of that.
mhm.
So if you start the sticks in a certain position, the ESC says, "Oh, you must want to go into programming mode. Welcome to programming mode." And then it expects you to do a bunch of stuff. And of course, if you accidentally get there, you don't know what you're doing.
You'll screw it all up.
Yeah. I think that's what happened to my X29. I ended up building the X29, and I think I accidentally limited my throttle throw.
hmm
So I can only, go up to like 70% throttle on the thing right now because the
Okay.
ESC says, oh, the the full the value that the transmitter is sending out as full throttle. The ESC is saying, okay, you want 70% throttle. Cool. That's the
Yeah.
top. We're good. And
It's
I'm
all
like,
how you
no,
set it up.
right. because I didn't realize I was in charge of setting throttle at that point when I was messing with the menu, the programming part of it by
Mm-hmm.
accident. And I went to go look at something. I left the throttle at like 3/4 throttle. And I was just kind of put my hands off it. I was looking around, kind of like, where the heck am I missing a piece? And then all of a sudden I heard beep, 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 or whatever the ESC does to denote, okay, got it. We'll
Yep, we're
set
good to
that
go.
throttle to 3/4. That's the max. And I'm like, and then, and of course, I'm still doing full throttle. Like, it's going a full range. I'm like, but that's not the same thrust it just had. Like, and we're talking with EDFs, that top 25% makes up 50% of the thrust. So 0 to 75 is like half of your thrust capacity. And when you go from that 75% to the 100%, you're almost doubling your thrust. So anyway, it was crazy. So you weren't able to get the simple cub, but he did get the build experience, which is
Um,
pretty helpful.
yeah, he got the build experience, and every build is an exercise in learning a little something, because and I'm going to eat crow for a second, because I've touted that I understand aerodynamics and I have all this sim time and I have I've done this, I've done that. And one of the mistakes I recognize in the build is that I was not up for trying to get the control wire linkages, the little screw thing that you stick the wire through and you screw another screw into the end of that.
Yep.
So that you can easily adjust lengths. Trying to get those in sometimes can be a pain, and I knew that when I did it, I had to use a a drill, I think, or a drill bit to kind of wallow out that hole a little bit, and I wanted to get it built for, like, let's get this thing built. Let's not go into all that right now. And so I did like the Z bends and stuff to shorten the cables. And again, eating crow for a minute, should have known better. But I think this contributed to part of the problem, which was that both of the ailerons sat high. So both ailerons were angled up a little bit instead of being flush with the rest of the wing. And I was looking at it, I was like, man, like, I've been really working the Z-bend trying to get it pulled in, and they're even. They're even. They're sticking up by the same amount, and it ain't much.
Mm-hmm.
It'll probably be fine because they're sticking up the same amount. And what I'm wondering is if I wasn't inducing nose up with both ailerons being up a bit, which is some of what I was experiencing with that plane. I don't know.
It's
shouldn't have tried to fly it that way.
Unlikely. It's unlikely. You should have seen what I tried to fly today. I had something very similar to what you just described, and it flew. It flew okay. But it's a lot more touchy, I think, is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's harder to get balanced. And if you're just starting out, that's one thing you don't want to have to deal with.
Yeah. So there's that. Now, took it out, bit of damage to the plane from like landing gear because it didn't want to take off right. Or yeah, I had trouble getting it to take off. I was trying to do more of a taxi takeoff, like proper takeoff rather than chucking.
Yeah.
And
it tends to save the plane more often than not.
Yeah. And anyway, so between landing gear catching grass as the plane cut left hard during taxi, and then just some rough landings because it wasn't wanting to fly right. I felt bad because I was going flying Sunday morning, right at noon or so when I was like Rachel was ready to head home. We had to go, and I was like, okay, well, I'll take my brother-in-law flying because my father-in-law can't get out and fly. Well, I'll get it up in the air, trim it out, hand it the controller. We'll have like 15, 20 minutes. This thing ought to take off and be fine. It wasn't, so I felt terrible leaving him with, you got a little bit of patchwork, dude. Wasn't terrible. He had to like re-glue some pieces, and we've talked about it, and I've apologized to him. Like I feel really bad because his first message to me was, "How you gonna leave me with a busted plane?" Ha 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 ha. I'm like, oh,
He's giving you a bunch of crap.
you're
Nice.
killing me, man. You're killing me. But
that means,
yeah, it's
that at least means he likes you.
yeah. I mean, he and I get along great. I did feel bad about it. I told him, I was like, look, it is never my intention to cut and run but had to go.
Yeah, but you had to go, right?
My intent was take the brother-in-law out flying, get up in the air, trim it, make sure it's right, hand him the controller. He'd have 5 or 10 minutes flight time, and then I gotta get on the road. So I'm going to build the simple Cub in my own time out of my materials. No, I don't have a plan. I'll probably do a piece together plan at that point, print out on multiple pages,
Sure.
so that I can say, okay, yes, the Cub does fly, and get the better experience on that, because I'm sure that it's a great plane. I just didn't have a good first experience, and I recognized that there were flaws in my building of that one. At the same time, interesting, I want to ask you, have you ever experienced a servo that does not return to the zero correctly?
I've had servos fail in a lot of different ways. Is it one that was from flight test?
I wasn't going to say it, but yes.
Well, I'm just saying because he can call them up and talk to them about it. They might send him an extra servo in a bubble package, and he'll have it in a week.
Yeah.
Yeah, they happen. Like, so 9 out of every 10 servos I buy work great.
Are fine.
And,
yeah.
And that 1 out of 10, they have an issue. Sometimes it's right out of the bat. Sometimes it's a little ways in. Like, I literally bought a kit that was a wing, and it has 2 servos. They're awesome. I'm like, cool, these work great, and blah blah blah. And I test them, and I center them, and it's all working great. And I put them in the wing, and I hook up the control rod, and I tighten it so it's just like the right thing. And then I go to work it back and forth, making sure everything's good. And and the one just skips like it busted a tooth or something in there in the gears. I'm like, oh crap. So now I've got like one servo that works great and one servo that doesn't. And so I'm like, oh shoot,
Yeah, and I know these things are mass produced.
Yeah, and that happens. Right, they get mass produced into billions, it seems.
Yeah.
And they're complex too, because they are a motor, they're a very small electronic board to control it. It's a potentiometer in there. Yeah. And it's a whole series of absolutely tiny gears, right? Made out of either nylon or metal or some other thing, with 3 really tiny 0.5 millimeter diameter shafts that sit in this plastic housing on the top. I mean, all of these are individual parts that they either had to manufacture there and pull together, or they bought them from other places and assembled them. Like, right. So either way you shake it, it's its own complex item, right? It's not something that's just I cut it out of a mold and I sent it to you.
Yeah, and I'm not, and why I wasn't going to put a name to it is, I get these things are mass produced, and any servo can have the problem. I think you've opened up servos that are generally good and had a dead one. I think that might have been just a bad run. There was some humming in some of them where they were sitting there just like twitching, like very very tiny, but they were just like
pretty normal, honestly. Like they're not zeroing out right; they're waiting for it. And then what happens is if you tap the controller to kind of go out to the thing and back to neutral again, it may be because in your transmitter, your 0, it doesn't return to exactly 0; it returns to 1 or -2, right? Which that's within like a dead zone, and you can change the dead zone in your transmitter so that it will not pick up from -2 to 2, right? It will always send that little window as 0. Right. So that way when you pop your transmitter, it will bring that to 0 and it'll send the 0 signal to the servo. And sometimes it's that's the only thing I can suggest. There's other methods to deal with that too. But that's not as much of a thing to worry about. Although it does suck because you're like, well, every time it's doing that, it's drawing power.
Yeah, it's not the power that I'm necessarily concerned about.
No, but I mean it's something. And if
Yeah,
you leave a plane there for 30 minutes with a servo or two that are pulling power, you're gonna have a lot less in the battery than you realize. You're cutting off a half a minute of plane fun.
yeah. I may have to talk to him sometime and have him run some tests on those servos then, because I didn't even
Hmm.
think about, is the buzz coming from the servo in general, or is it because of the transmitter sending a slightly off
Hmm.
signal?
And
Um,
that's what happens oftentimes. It's when you get like a teeth grinding kind of, or that it's like it's skipping, like you hear
mhm,
it almost jitter. Now that's the other thing is it will jitter sometimes because it's receiving. I'm trying to think. It's
the,
it's more about the kind of signal it's receiving. It's
right.
kind of going this or that, this or that, this or that, and I can't agree on which one, so it goes back and forth.
Okay.
There's more to that too, and I think that's a little bit out of my depth because I don't pay too close attention to those things. But they are that's also fairly common and not the end of the world. It's not a good sign, but you'll probably be fine to fly the Cub around a while.
Yeah.
Um,
The humming didn't bother me so much as there were two servos that had more prominent issues. One was, and I replaced that servo in the build. I gave him one of mine that I had in the car because I took all my
hmm
stuff.
hmm
I think one servo was slow. If I remember correctly, it was slower than the other one. Or
Interesting.
it was fast in one direction and slow returning, which then you're going to imbalance, especially considering that was in the aileron.
Hmm
So I replaced that servo with one of mine. I said like servos are like $3. Don't worry about it. And I've got a few extra. I'm not using it right now. And then I did not replace this servo because it was getting so late. And I was like, well, if we're aware of it, we can. If we're aware of it and mindful of it when we're flying, we'll know we'll know what to expect on how the plane handles. But the servo that was connected to the elevator, when you would nose up, it would return to zero fine. When you nosed down, I think it was when you nosed down and then returned to zero, the servo would actually pass zero in the going. It would just go past zero to a point. Even though the stick was at
Mm.
zero, you'd nose up, you'd go back to zero, you'd nose down, and it would pass zero.
Right, I get you. So basically, it starts out level. You go up, it comes back to zero, dead flat across
Mm-hmm.
the back, and then you go down, and it comes back, but it's not. It doesn't stop at dead level. It
Right.
ends up kind of
It
pulling
keeps
up a little
going
bit.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Enough that it would have caused the plane to then not be
Hmm.
level. And you can overcome that by saying, well, if I'm aware of it, then when I do this thing, I just bump the stick in the other direction, even minutely, and that'll send it back to
Hmm.
zero.
Hmm.
So I'm
Yeah,
not
but
sure
you don't want to
what.
have to think about that while you're flying if you're
Well,
new.
you don't want to, but
No, because that's
he's
just asking for a dead
yeah,
plane.
he's a little ways from flying again just yet. So I think I'm going to send him some links to some servos that he can order some more in just to have. But
Yeah.
say also that this would be a good servo to replace.
If
Um,
I might say, though, flight test oftentimes they used to exclusively order Emax servos, and Emax tends to do very good quality control on their products. They produce very good quality motors. Their ESCs are decent quality by Altel, and their servos are consistently solid.
mhm,
So, I mean, doesn't mean that they don't have bad ones. I mean, that just seems to be, but they are. So where I get my bulk, really cheap servos, I'm talking like they're a buck, right? Buck and a
mhm,
half, and Emax servos are like $5. So we're looking. That's kind of the quality level we're talking about. I'll buy 10, or let's say if I buy 50, I'll have five that won't work, right?
right.
Five, there's something wrong. That's not okay. The Emax servos, I'll probably have one, maybe two out of
Mhm,
that kind of batch. So you are far less likely to run into an issue with an Emax servo than a generic, Hobby Tower Pro, I think is the generic 9 gram blue servo. Again,
Oh,
they're
the
cheap.
ones that I'm using.
Yeah, that's the one that everybody uses. Are you kidding
Okay.
me? Yeah, most people use them, and the reason being is that they're you can tell the ones that don't work pretty quickly while you're doing your centering. Like when you're centering it and you're putting it in and you're testing, it will fail then before you get the plane into the air, most likely. Um, they're not super strong, so they're compared to like some of the higher torque servos or some of the higher end servos, they're more likely to strip in a crash. A lot of I've never really run into that as a big issue. The bigger issue I have is that they just don't, they don't launch. So
Hmm.
you try it and they just, oh, that one doesn't work, and you put it off to the side. The other ones, they work fine. So, um, but they're cheap and they're 9 grams and they do what you need. They're
Yeah.
fast enough. They have enough torque. They're connect just like every other servo. So, um, for what we need in foam planes that weigh under what 250 grams to 500 grams,
Oh yeah.
I mean that's more than enough to do what we need, and it's a great price.
And like I said, I get that. I figure that I just had it happens. That's why I wasn't
Yep.
going to attach a name to it. Cause like generally they're good. They're good for their stuff. But it's also I don't know worth trying to go in and get replaced. I was like, it's a cheap servo. Order some more. But what that does bring to mind is if they manage to do or they happen to do the stem stuff with this, let them know as you're buying kits. However, plan on buying
Yeah.
multiple extra
Mhm.
servos to have on hand in the event that a
This
servo show
fails,
comes
right?
out bad. I've
Hmm.
been fortunate none
Exactly.
of mine have been bad, but it's entirely possible that the guy that I bought them from had already done all the testing and said, "Oh, here's
Uh,
the bad ones, Chuck."
I'm pretty certain he did,
Yeah.
honestly.
Okay.
Um, so
Uh,
you also started something. We were talking about it because I have a simple sore, FT simple sore that I have a wing and I flew it a lot and then crashed it so much that the fuselage started to wiggle
mm-hmm.
both at the tail and the main section had been crumpled a bit. So I was like, I got to rebuild that. But the wing is still good. The wing is
Right.
solid. I actually ended up just reinforcing it because. So as I was doing that, you're like, oh yeah, that's the plane I want to build. Did you get a chance to build that?
I started to. Um, I got all the template parts cut out, the paper, and
Mm-hmm.
I started cutting some of the foam parts out. And when I went to fold the main section of the wing over, um, I don't know why I did this. One of those things where you're trying to cut a corner in a build, and I thought that I had done it before, and I think I probably did with my glider that I built originally, where I just took like a barbecue skewer, kind of ran in the what was going to be that big fold.
Uh-huh.
I kind of
Oh, so
ran that
you
through there and mashed the
compressed
foam. Yeah, I was
you
doing a foam
compressed the front
compression,
edge. Yeah.
and then took a bigger like popsicle stick and like really worked that foam, and the paper didn't hold up to the fold over. And so I just pop popped it right there. Um, and so okay, that there's a reason they say do the 45 when you're doing those folds. So
Yeah.
lesson learned on that. But no, I've not completed the simple soarer yet. I need to buckle down and get it done because when I can get out to fly, and which we're able to
Like
get
to
out of, yeah, we're out,
like
we're able to get
today.
out a bit more today.
Yeah,
So,
I was thinking today the clouds were small and poofy, which is that means that there's a lot of updrafts.
mm-hmm,
So that kind of day, so like during the day, that sucks for flying regular planes because you want clean air, right? And this is
right,
air that's going up or coming down, um, and basically forming the clouds. But that's perfect for soaring. So that's perfect for gliding
mm-hmm,
because what you're looking for is you're kind of hunting around for a thermal that'll lift you up so you can fly even longer. And you basically hunt around because again, you're just gliding, you're falling at a very slow rate. And then if you catch a thermal, you extend your time significantly. So on days like today, and I know you probably had the same kind of clouds. Um, yeah, that's the day to go soaring. So having one of those, I like having one of those. I've got one in the background. Well, one of those is always great to have on hand for days like today.
Mm.
And
So,
you're just standing out in the sun, relaxing, maybe sitting in a chair, and just with the sunglasses on and just watching the sky, just cruising around. You can take a plane that would normally the battery would last maybe 8 minutes or 6 minutes, and with a soaring plane, if it's motorized, you can make that battery. It'll probably last a good 30 to 40 minutes. I've definitely done it over an hour, easy.
yeah, because
And that's
you're not powering a motor the whole time.
no, you just run it to get it at some altitude, and you're soaring around trying to catch as many thermals as you can. And then when it starts getting real low, then you're like, okay, it's time to run it again and bring it back up. It's awesome, and I want you to have that experience. It's relaxing. Um, it's enjoyable for me,
Mm.
and I think it's something. If you you enjoyed the FD Fogey, the old Fogey. So this is kind of a similar, gentle flying experience.
I'm looking forward to finishing it. I just got to buckle down and do it.
Yeah, man.
Um, that said,
Call me next time so we can build.
yeah, we have spent a lot of time talking about my builds and failures and all that. Let's talk about your stuff, and then we'll actually get into what we're going to get into this episode.
Okay. Shoo, boy. It was build fever, or it still is. I don't know. We finished up. Let's see. February finished up the Builduary month challenge that I put together on the FT forums. So I succeeded in building the 4 planes I had set out to build. Actually, not the 4 planes I set out to build. I built 4 other planes. I think one of them was the one I planned, and a lot of people joined in, and it seemed like things landed in 3 camps. There's the people who wanted to do it, and life got in the way, and it just didn't happen. And it didn't help that everybody was starting to lock down, and nobody was knowing what the heck was going on at
Mm-hmm.
that time, which is fine. Um, and so they like, I still want to build these planes, and I'm glad I I entered this challenge because now I've already got my mind set. I've got my plans ready. I've got the build. I'm ready to go. So
Right.
when I get that build bug, I'm ready to do it. So thank you for putting that together. That made me feel pretty cool, pretty good about that. And then there's people like me who we did the 4. We built them, we flew them, we had video footage. It was fantastic. And then we had the other camp, which was I've never seen so many builds in 1 month ever. It was crazy. I think the one guy had 11 or 12 builds. The other guy right behind him with 9. And then there's a couple other guys who had 6 or 7. And
They
I
were
mean,
cranking
that's
them
like
out.
they were cranking them out almost every day. They had a different plan, and they had videos and build logs and pictures and some of them, like in those 11, were custom built planes. The one guy, half of those 11 planes, if not more, were planes he thought up, cut out, designed, and flew very successfully too. Um, and he came up with like 6 new designs on the fly within 1 month. Built them, flew them, tested, filmed, wrote up a build log. It was awesome. I just absolutely inspiring. And if you're listening, I give you the golf clap of joy. And it's anyway. And a matter of fact, a guy who's out of Israel is the one who managed to win that challenge because he just kept building. I mean, it was awesome. I mean, it's just really cool to see. And that kind of brings us to one of the other things we kind of did in this time is every once in a while we would kind of throw together. There's a bunch of people who kind of joined us on the Discord server here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we have a thing called Build Party. And it's basically just, hey, if you're online, say, hey, man, I'm building. Anybody else kind of around? And some people are doing the same thing you are. And you just basically call them up on Discord and you all sit there and chat while you build and talk about planes or talk about life. And half of the chat, I think, was oftentimes how we're all coping with COVID around the world, and that kind of stuff. So we did some of that. We did a couple of the build parties during the challenge, and we also did. I followed up with an April showers challenge. I've done it a couple of years in a row now. It's just basically build a plane that can fly in, or fly on or off of water. Um, Last year it was the Spruce Goose, which we'll talk about in a second. But this year I gave up the Goose, at least for this project, and I decided I had a kit for the Sea Angel, and that is the anime plane that's out of Porco Rosso, which is
Hmm.
uh, anyway, it's basically it's a water plane with a big motor kind of chunked up on top. It's actually an Italian plane, and I can't remember what the original model is called, but it's fantastic. It was designed by Andres and James over at Flight Test, and they did a great job putting together a very robust build. It's very sturdy, um, and it's interesting because it definitely. It, so I ended up finishing the build at like the last day of the month, and it was raining. It was just great, and I went to bring it outside to fly in the rain, and well, it stopped raining. The good news was, well, like because so I'm literally like outside pulling all the stuff into my car, and it's raining outside. As I'm driving over to the field, the rain stops. I'm like, oh shoot. When I got to the
Dadgummit.
field, I'm like, oh, maybe I won't be able to complete this challenge. Darn it. Um, so I'm like, wait a second though. One, there's a quarry with a big water. It's basically a big lake now in the very back corner of the field. I'm like, I might be able to do it off of that, although I would like to retrieve this plane. I built it and I flew it a couple times, so I knew how it flew and I knew what to look for. That plane has high tip stall tendencies, so when it gets low speed, the wings just start to lose their lift and they dip. Um, and one does it before the other, and that's really dangerous when you're trying to land. So that's one of the benefits of landing on water. You come in at a pretty high speed, so it
Right.
doesn't lose the lift. You don't have a tip stall. But if you're trying to land it on the grass, if you come in hot and it's not a greased landing, just so you're gonna lose. So you either go slow and then you tip stall and you crash, or you come in hot, and if you come in at the wrong angle, the momentum is going to stop the bottom pod. The wings are kind of set up off of the pod, like a biplane.
Hmm.
So, but on top of that, like another biplane, is the motor pod. So you've
So it's
got
top
all
heavy.
this mass up high. So if the bottom stops dead, the wing moves forward, the motor shoves forward, and that whole thing kind of like twists. And so that makes it really important that you grease field landings if you're not doing it off of water. But the cool part was I went to the field, and there's a big giant pond puddle that was probably about 100 feet long or 70 feet long and maybe 6 feet wide, and it was about ankle deep, which is perfect. It was just enough to kind of get in there. So I posted that video to my thing. So I flew off and I flew around a couple times. I landed on it a couple times. I flew off again, which was a lot of fun. So it makes me wish I had a couple more lakes to fly off of. And it makes me reinvigorated to get back to the Spruce Goose and get back to building a couple waterproof planes that I can use either in the rain or more importantly, kind of to fly off of puddles or ponds that we have in the area. Um, so I also tried to fly the Spruce Goose. We talked about that. I got to the point where I was testing it, and I was doing the wiring, and that took forever to get me to kind of figure out how to get it to work. So I did it, and I tested it, and it was all the motors were going, and it looked great, and it was coming up off the thing as I tested it. I brought it out to the field, and it started turning, I think, right. And no matter how much left rudder, it would just keep trying to turn right, which means the motors were spinning at different speeds no matter how much I tried to set the throttle values for the ESCs. So I would turn everything on. I'd set the throttle to the top to basically say, "Hey man, before we get going, I want you to know which is my top throttle and what's my bottom. So what's the range?" And I
Hmm.
want to do that for all the 8 ESCs that are in that plane. So I did that, and then I would get it set. Okay, good. All the ESCs, beep 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 beep. 8 of them all at once or
Yeah, I remember hearing
staggered.
that thing fire up over
Oh
the
my
Bill
god.
Party channel.
Yeah, it's like Christmas, right?
It's crazy.
So it's crazy. So I got those set, and then so I'm like, okay, maybe this will fix it. And I ran it up, and I tried a bunch of different times. There is tons of power, and it's more than enough to have the plane take off. It feels, even though it's kind of heavy with all that stuff, and I'm using I think 5,000 milliamp 3 cell battery in there, so it's pretty heavy. But
Hmm.
this plane wants to take off so bad, but it's too busy doing circles, and I can't figure out why. So I realized I'm like, okay, how do I fix this? Do I want to undo all the wiring and rewire it? And my short answer is, oh gosh, no, please don't.
Yeah,
Please
because let me
don't.
cut in for a second. I saw that over our Discord chat, and buddy, that's some interesting wiring going on in there right now.
Yeah, I don't know how to tidy it. I can't even think of how. I would love to have it tidy, but I'm not so confident in my soldering that I can just, I don't know. Anyway, point is I'm going to have to desolder every one of those ESCs and kind of reset it up, which isn't terrible, but I don't know. I'm going to have to figure it out.
It's gonna be
Um,
time.
right. It's going to be time, and it's going to have inspiration for me to do it. So I had a ton of other things. I had the April Showers Challenge. I was finishing up reviewing all the build jewelry stuff, and plus I have a lot of things, other projects I want to do too. A lot of builds. Let's see. I'm building my full version of the Synergy. Synergy, if you look it up, it's a box tail wing plane. Look up Synergy plane. Really amazing plane. Um, Very beautiful. I built somebody had the same idea I did almost at the same time, and he put together like a very small size, and I by small size I mean about 30-inch wingspan. Um, he put together a quick, dirty version of it, like a flight test version, kind of
Uh,
boxy, but it flies great. It's awesome. I love it. And so I'm doing the Master Build series version where it's a curved pod. It's a series of sections that create a laminar flow around the outside. It's the curved over wings. It's a full box bar, and I think the full it's somewhere around a 50 to 60-inch span wing.
Goodness.
So it's a big mammoth jammer. It's going to be a C pack motor, if not bigger. Um, so I was working on that. Uh, I also did the. I was talking to Dr. Looping Louis, which is one of the members of the forums. He's out of Germany. We were just talking because we were both sitting at home doing work, or not, depending on who you were. Like he was home from school, so he was like, "Oh, what do I do?" So he was building planes, and he was going, "Hey, what are you doing now?" I'm like, "I'm working, but we can chat." So we chatted, and I was talking about wanting to put together a plane that'd be good, slow enough for indoors with a kind of existing setup. He's like, dude, do you have the Speedster? He goes, make it a biplane. So the Speedster is like an old mini, like Mighty Mini plane from Flight Test,
Hmm.
way back in the beginning of it all. And it's just a simple um, bent bent wing, like an undercambered one crease wing. You basically build two of them, and it has a dual dihedral. You build two of the wings, and you set one on top of the other with popsicle barbecue skewers, and you put a little APAC motor in the front, like an 1806, and off you go. It's slow, and it has a lot of lift, and it flies great. It's responsive, and it's a lot of fun. So it's one I could see easily working inside a gymnasium. Although it'll be a little tight, but it should be a lot of fun to kind of go around hoops. Um, and let's see. And then I also I had a design for an S3B Viking, which is a Navy aircraft carrier type plane. And it's like a workhorse, and that's a whole story in and of itself. But suffice it to say, I was inspired by a colleague who is an ex-Navy pilot, and he's flown probably every single plane you could fly onto or off of an aircraft carrier. And that's essentially where he worked, was
Hmm.
on the aircraft carrier, making sure the planes went in and out. He said he did 30, 34 landings and 33 catapults in an hour. So 33 takeoffs and 34 landings, I think is how he put it, in an hour. It's just one of those where they do the run, where they basically get shot off the front end, they come around and they land. They can put on the catapult again, they get shot off the front, and they just keep doing that and see how many they can do in an hour.
Now he was in the cockpit on that.
He's flying. I've got a bunch of
That's
pictures of him flying.
yeah, that's actually a testament to the ground crew that
Yeah,
was supporting to get that deck transformed from landing to flight mode or landing to launch mode that quick.
right, right. And he says that that's part of the challenge. That's part of what he was doing, was to make sure that the ground crew, you know, has that has that under the belts, because when things are hitting the fan and they've got to launch nearly the entire flight, all the planes that are in the aircraft carrier, they got to launch them that kind of quick.
Right.
And so the ground crew's got to be ready. And you're right, it is an absolute testament to that. So I designed that with that inspiration, knowing that there's a guy out there who's like, that's his favorite plane. He's like, dude, if you build that plane, I'll come out and watch you making it, and we'll fly it together. You take me on a ride. This is gonna be awesome. Like, and he was all supportive. He was one of those guys who's like, I take my hat off to you, RC pilots. I know I'm a pilot, and you guys think it's awesome, and like, yeah, it's cool, but it's like driving a bus. It's a
Mm.
fast bus and it's complex, but it's still a bus. He goes, you guys are standing on the ground looking at something that's not even going the direction you're going, and you're getting it to do acrobatics without even blinking an eye. That's crazy. You're greasing landings from perspective. Like, you don't even have perspective. The thing's flying in the sky. You have no idea where it really is. And yet you're still doing all these great maneuvers. Like, you guys are doing something that's just very difficult. And, my hat's off to you. So he goes, yeah, I'd love to see one. I'd love to see you build one and see it fly. And yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. So I was like, okay. So I had the design for a while, and I figured it's time to build it. And then lastly, I have that Volantex ASW 28, the one I almost crashed into your car.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
gave us both a scare.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? Well, so after that crash, I ended up fixing it up. It didn't take a whole lot to do. It was actually a good way to test a couple methods of repairs. Um, and then I'm going around, and I had flying around like normal. It was pretty just fun. There's a couple of days I had been doing that already, enjoying the plane itself. And then I was like, I want to do a speed run. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring it all the way up in the sky, and I'm going to let it do a nosedive. And just about like maybe 100 feet up, I'm going to pull it into level, and I'm going to have it go zooming across at eye level. It's going to be awesome. As fast as it can let it go, right?
It's just one of those. That was a really good idea in my head.
Yeah. So what happened is, as I tried to pull it out of the nosedive, the force from the plane going so fast and me trying to throw it to full throws to get the tail to kind of rotate down to be level,
Mm-hmm.
the elevator servo couldn't pull that kind of torque, which means it didn't deflect, not nearly enough, which
Right.
means I got about till maybe 15% off of dead down.
Oh man.
And that's how it hit the ground.
So it was almost non-responsive at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was like, oh no. I'm like, ah. Oh. So here's a testament to Volantics. Okay. There's a couple things that I had gripes with the kit in general, but the fuselage is still in one piece. The motor
Okay.
still works. I think I smoked the ESC. No, I busted the battery. The ESC is still fine.
You
Um,
busted the battery and didn't lose the whole thing.
no, it just poked a hole, so it didn't actually like short it out or anything.
Uh.
But at that point, I took the battery out of service. It's just I don't trust trying to recharge it, you know.
Right.
Um, and at that point, I think it was at like storage cell. So it's clearly I've got to bring it back to the batteries plus to get rid of it, and we'll probably cover that stuff next episode. But Anyway, so I'm sitting there going like, oh my God, I just destroyed like the one plane I can always just grab and go because it's always awesome. And I just busted the crap out of it. And I did. I mean, I busted the canopy. I messed up the tail and a bunch of the surfaces kind of came off. But most of it is actually a lot more fixable than I thought it was going to be.
Okay.
It's an incredibly sturdy craft. It had no business surviving that craft. I'm going to say, thank God, the farmer had just tilled the fields.
Okay.
So the ground was incredibly soft and light and loamy. Um, and I did manage to get it to at least a slight angle. So it wasn't all just terminal velocity into the ground like a missile.
So how many cartwheels did it do?
None. That's the
No.
problem. It just
it just kind of arrow into the ground. Thunk.
Yep, and the wings flexed in a way I didn't think that foam and that plane is supposed to flex, which I'm pretty sure it's not. But it came back and it survived it for the most part. I have again a couple of the trailing edges and control surfaces I have to attach better or reattach. But again, so my hat's off to Volantex for coming up with some of the most sturdy craft to handle the dumbest thing I could have ever thought to do. Pardon me. Oh man. Yeah. Anyway, so that's it makes me sad. Um it's just like today. I took out Tony the Tiger, right? That's the Explorer. And I
Mhm.
had it flying around and it was not handling itself right. The wingtips have been messed up quite a bit over the years or over the months of hitting it. Um, just like today, I'm bringing it in and it's coming in at kind of an angle, and it's very gusty because of those the updrafts.
Right.
So it's kind of coming up and then going down, and so I'm like kind of adjusting the throttle and trying to like occasionally the wingtip will just pick up, and so it's starting to throw it across the field. It's starting to come at me. I'm like, oh, cool. Well, no, that's all right. I'll rudder it over, and it's trying to correcting for it, and it's coming around on the ground, and it's coming like right in front, and there's nobody out in the field. It's just me. Um, it's near dusk, and it comes right in front of all the control stations and goes right into the two poles that are cemented into the ground that hold the big planes. Like again, this is a giant scale yard, so they put the big planes that need that have the gassers, and they rev up the motor and they get it running and they check the motor. But those poles are cemented in the ground so the plane doesn't go anywhere, and that
Right.
way you don't have to be in the back of the plane holding the tail in place so the plane doesn't take off accidentally, and you could fiddle with the motor. Um, so so my that glider plane, the Explorer, smacked into that and kind of went back and forth a couple different times, and all it did was mess up the wingtip a little bit.
Oh wow.
Yeah, incredibly sturdy. I was like, oh, nice. That one I have a carbon fiber rod going through the entire wing,
Nah, that
um,
helps.
so that helps a lot. I think it was just purely foam board; it would have been busted by now. But uh, again, it's one of those planes where everybody's like, "Oh yeah, you go through planes left and right." I'm like, "Well, sort of, but I repair them. Like I've got
Yeah.
planes from 3-4 years ago; they still fly okay.
You got
They're
planes
not."
for days, man.
Well, that's true. We won't get into that. It makes a lot of people unhappy. I think people
That's
come to
what,
my house and be like, "Aren't you supposed to be doing like? Why do you have so many planes?"
yeah, that does make me unhappy.
I know, right?
Uh, so but I guess before we get out of the what have we been doing, um, I think it was last episode. You said that you had a plane that you built. And you ended up utilizing the shaft and slot wing mount that I was considering for the
Oh yeah,
glider
yeah.
build. What's going on with that plane? How's that worked out for you?
Oh man, I haven't done anything to it. That is another anime plane. It is a Miyazaki movie from Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind. It's the Bumble Crow, and it's like a tiny scale. The Bumble Crow is like a massive transport plane. Imagine like a C-17, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of scale. It's even bigger, I think, if you were to put it the imaginary plane next to the real one, right? But it's on that order. Um, I just left it where it was because I
Okay.
need to cut out a ton of circles, and I need to do the throw tests. So um, when I start doing like the CG testing and the actual like flight testing of it, I always shy away from that because I've had such bad luck. And I love the way that plane looks. I don't want to bust it, but I
Right.
should just get off my ass and do it. Just load the nose up so that it balances where it's supposed to, and just start heaving it. And what I need to do is find some tall grass that I can heave it into.
Yeah, because that would soften it.
Yeah, and then I could confidently try a bunch of different things and actually find the CG before it gets destroyed. That tends to be where my issue is. Like if I don't have the CG really close, which generally you can get pretty close, but sometimes it's not. And if it isn't, your crashes are really hard. And I think most of the foam board, no matter how light it is, can only take about 3 or 4 crashes before stuff doesn't start. It doesn't work right anymore, and
Right.
you should probably just rebuild it. So, um, yeah, I need to find a soft field to throw it towards some tall grass. So right now it's stalled. It's not gone. It's still in the other room,
Okay.
but it's on the table of one of these minutes. I will spend time with it, and it will be what it needs to be.
I was just curious.
Yeah, yeah.
See how that one was going for you.
Yeah, the Bumble Crow is at a stall, but much like almost every single project I've had, where I get to a point, and if it didn't succeed, oftentimes I've got to pause, or either I'm at a point where it's going to destroy the plane if it fails, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, I kind of hold up, I take a deep breath, I get myself psyched up, and then I go for it. So I'm in that pause mode for like the spruce goose, um, for the foamy bird of time, the bumble crow. Those are examples.
Okay.
But that's just how I operate. So that means that I end up having about like 6 or 7 projects that are in various stages of being completed at any given moment.
Okay. That's been a lot.
It's been a long time.
It has. You
Been a
ready to
long
get
time.
into it though?
Yeah, man, let's do it. We're looking to talk today about motors, basically the drivetrain of our aviation system. So our airplanes, even helicopters or pretty much anything you throw into the air, typically, if it's RC, it's typically has some kind of motor system, unless it's a free flight glider. And so motors can be really confusing. They're super important, but they can be really confusing because there's a lot to them, and there's a bunch of random numbers. Um, like if you know what a 2306 2300 kV with a 12p 14n is, then you probably don't need to listen to the episode. But if you do need help with that, that's kind of what this episode's about. So we're going to start we're going to really just cover 2 basic kinds of electric motors. We're going to cover brushed and we're going to cover brushless. We're going to start with the definitions and work to brushed, and that's going to cover a lot of the bases, and we're going to use those bases to go into what's most commonly used in RC aircraft, the brushless motor. And so I'm going to lean on Joe because Joe has got some pretty good experience with brushed, and he has also been making sure that all the things that he's got in his noggin are in tune with the rest of the world. So I'm going to leave it to him. Joe, what should we know about brushed motors?
Okay, so I won't speak too highly of my brush motor experience, as this is the first RC hobby that
Yeah,
I've gotten into.
but you've got like power tools and stuff. Those are brushed motors,
Yeah,
aren't they?
yeah, they are. I've done some work with them, but definitely not on the level that I'm working with motors here. Like I guess I have torn a brushed motor apart, but I wouldn't have known what I was looking at the
Right.
time. So I
You
will
weren't
go
going
ahead.
down the You weren't going down. Sorry, you weren't going down internet rabbit holes in the
Yeah,
process of taking it apart, were you?
yeah, no. Well, at the time that I was, that would have mattered to me. Before I got into other things in my childhood, we were
Hmm.
still on dial-up, so that research on random topics was limited at that time. Anyway, um,
Good.
we're dating ourselves, Matthew.
That's okay.
Um, so brush motors, and I'm gonna go ahead and preface this with I've done I've done some reading, I've done some research, I have watched some videos, and I have listened to another podcast that covered this topic. And so I would not be able to directly say this is where I read this from or this is where I heard this at. In conjunction with some of the knowledge that I already had about them. But I'm going to go ahead, because I did listen to an episode and they had some good information in there. I'm going to go ahead and call out the RC Plane Lab. Ron and I, Ron being one of the hosts of the RC Plane Lab, and I have been exchanging emails and talking about podcasting. And they had some really good information in their episode 20 regarding electric motors, ESCs, and how to choose some of that stuff. So they end up covering some of the same stuff we did. We were kind of chuckling about that in the email chain as we were talking about stuff.
Yeah, I listened to their episode 20 as well as kind of happenstance and went, oh my God, they just covered the things that we're going to start talking about too.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to hear how they approached it. They have maybe a different tact on it, but it's all the same information. So if what we say doesn't make any sense, go listen to theirs. Maybe what they say says it in a way you'll understand.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
either way, you can't go too terribly wrong.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, nothing does it like seeing an animated image in front of you. So to that point, as much as possible, and I don't have links to them right this second, so I'm not going to say, hey, here's a link to this, go check the show notes for it. But we'll have some links to stuff that you guys can check out, and hopefully be able to follow along as we're talking about this. Also, I want to reference 2 videos specifically because I enjoy the channel. It's Electro Boom. It's a YouTube channel. I enjoy the way that he dives into stuff. I think he's an electrical engineer, but he really covered. I watched 2 of his videos twice over to kind of understand some of the stuff, and it's still a bit of what black magic as far as how some of this stuff works. But I'll have links to the 2 videos that I was that I was looking at for some detailed information in there. I would encourage you to go look at those and listen to RC Plane Lab just because it's all good information. That said, just as a heads up, Electro Boom, the language barrier is a little looser on that channel. So where we try to keep things PG rated, if you've got, kids, maybe, watch it first. It's nothing terrible, but if you're uncomfortable with that, watch it first before you let your kid watch it. Okay, brush motors. So, as much as I understand brush and brushless, brushless motors have a lot of the same components and operate very similarly to brush, which is why we're going to start here. Even though we don't use a lot of brushed in this hobby, I know they utilize brushed motors in RC trucks and cars, potentially even the lower end quadcopters.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And even the FT Easy Stem package uses DC motors.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
they're present in the hobby, but it's not prevalent.
Right. So brush motors, typically DC driven. They are called brush motors because they utilize brushes to transfer the electricity to the coils. So let's go through some parts. Brush motors are going to have, typically they'll have the permanent magnets, although some motors will have electromagnets on the stator. The stator, which is the stationary bit of the motor, typically the outside of the motor. The rotor, which is going to be typically the inside component of the motor, the rotor is what actually turns. Another term that sometimes gets or often gets attached to rotor is the armature, which becomes more important when we're talking about the coils. The shaft is attached to the rotor. Rotor turns the shaft. Shaft connects to whatever you're trying to drive. Excuse me. The commutator, which is going to be interesting to talk about, but it is essentially what the brushes touch up against to transfer the electricity to the coils. The coils being the copper wire that's wound around the armatures. And then your brushes, which, interestingly enough, and I remember listening to the RC Plane Lab, and they were talking about it, and I'm going to pull from there when they say the brushes are not called brushes because they have bristles. And when we
But
were,
that's what I thought.
yeah,
I thought there were a bunch of like little paintbrushes somewhere in the motor, and they just
it,
sort of wore down.
yeah, in as much as that might be what is how it's named, I imagine that'd be problematic for the actual function of the motor. So the brushes are really solid pieces of conductive material that come into contact with the commutator. The commutator is multiple bits of metal, conductive material that go around the shaft. The brushes touch up against those, and electricity is transferred from the brushes to the commutator. And each commutator is electrically isolated from each other commutator. So they go around the shaft of the motor, but they're separated from each other so that when you're touching one and touching another, electrically they're not sending signal between each other to get to the other one. Motor goes in through, electricity goes in through the brushes to the commutator. From the commutator, then we get into the coils. Now, your coils are your typically copper wire that connects from the various commutators around the shaft. They connect to the commutator, wrap around the armature or the arms of the rotor to form the coils, and then return to a separate commutator. Now, this was one that I was not aware of, but a coil does not go from a commutator as a wire, do its loops, and then go back to that commutator, or go to the commutator on the opposite side of the shaft. It goes to the next commutator on the next one over. And those, so that as the motor turns, the brushes then are in contact with one or two commutators at a time, and that controls how electricity is flowing through the coils. Yeah, so your rotor is rotating within the stator, which is typically with a DC brush motor, your outside casing of the motor. Commutator is at the back end, which all the coils tie into. Brushes brush up against.
The commutator would be near the back end, near the where the screws screw in and anchor the case, basically, and the case remains stationary.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct. And I know with brushless motors, you have your in-runners and outrunners, which I know you'll talk about, but with DC motors, to my knowledge, DC brush motors, I didn't see any real examples of brush motors that had outside components that spun around. I'm sure it's possible. That just wasn't in any examples that came up on my end.
It's not. Most of the brushed motors, I think, in the RC hobby are predominantly in runners.
Mm-hmm.
The advantage of an outrunner is that you get a higher mass spinning. Like the mass is further away from the shaft point, creating a higher torque, basically, a force at a distance. That's your torque. So there's more mass spinning further away, so it creates more torque. So that's the advantage of using maybe an outrunner, and that's part of the reason. Well, we'll get into it, but part of the reason why a lot of people go towards brushless. But in brushed motors, the typical is the in-runner. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's perfectly fine. Um, an outrunner and in-runner just strictly defines which part of the motor is actually turning. So those are the parts and a little bit of how that energy is transferred. When you're looking at images of this, I would actually, highly suggest looking at either animated or a video representation of it, so you really get a grasp of how how the rotor is turning and the commutators around the shaft are then turning and coming into contact with the brushes. Some who have heard people talk about brushed motors may have heard about brushes being replaced. Brush motors, the brushes are literally brushing against the commutator part of the motor, so as that motor's turning, it's a friction point. It's actually a touch contact, and so as the motor's turning, when the brush is slipping and sliding on that commutator, so there's friction that's going on there where it's wearing down the brushes physically, but also as the connections move from one commutator to the next, as that motor's turning, there is arcing that'll occur. And that one always mystified me when I used a power drill. Now that I'm thinking back in the past, I would use Dad's old power drills, and I don't see it too much in mine. Maybe my brushes are still running in decent shape, but his old power drills I grab hold of and go to run it and do some drilling, and you could look in through the cooling vents in the back of the drill, and you just see this electric blue arcing going on inside.
Yeah,
and that
sparking.
Would be, yeah, that tells you that something's going on.
It's on fire, Dad.
And that's actually where the brushes, which again are stationary, are coming into and out of contact with the commutator around the shaft as that rotor and the shaft are turning. Those commutators are turning. So as they're coming into contact and losing contact with the different points on the commutator, yeah, I might have misplaced a word there, but as all that's happening is the brushes are coming into and losing contact with the commutators, they're arcing.
Right. And of course that would potentially degrade the conductivity of the commutator over time.
Potentially. Probably.
I'm sure it's very little, but still, yeah. It's another point of wear on the motor, right?
Right. More the damage that occurs is to the brushes.
Right.
And that is, anytime you have electrical arcing, there's damage to the material. I would imagine, and it's not unlike welding. I mean, that's part of what welding is, especially if you're doing arc welding. So,
yeah,
I can't point you to any paper that says this. I'm pulling a bit, from behind me on this one, but I would imagine that as that arcing is occurring, you're roughing up the surface of that brush, and then as it continues to turn and move, that roughness is now almost like sandpaper. So there's there's additional wear that's going on because of the arcing.
Right.
Now, some brush motors you can replace the brushes in. It depends on how it's built. Others can't. But if you've ever had, say, if you're your age, Matthew,
Joe, if you've got a saw, you can get to the inside of those brushes.
I'm
just kidding. And I'm just kidding. Honestly,
a lot of them have, I would imagine.
A lot of them have tabs on the can that you have to basically bend out to allow access, and some of them are screwed so that they're designed so you can get into them. Because as a brushed motor, that's going to be one of the only things that wears fast in the motor. So if you can get in and replace them, you've essentially restored your motor back to almost new, and you can run it for another lifetime, essentially. Because of the parts that wear, that's going to happen far faster than any other part in the motor itself, as I understand it. Is that right?
That is true, up to the point that the bearing fails. And I know I didn't list the bearing. I know I didn't list the bearing in the parts list, but the bearing in a brush motor that has bearings is what allows the shaft to turn and holds it in place. Now, you also have, with brush motors, you could have one without bearings, which deals more with a
So bushing.
what am I thinking? A coupling, a bushing.
Yeah, it's a bushing.
The problem with bushings is that they're going to wear, and then you'll get some wiggle.
Right. Which could be at 50,000 RPMs or whatever some of these in small end runners. That's the other benefit of an end runner, right? It has low inertia, so you can spin the dickens out of it. So you can spin it really fast. But if it's got a lot of wiggle, that's gonna destroy your motor pretty fast if it's wiggling around a bunch at 50,000 RPMs.
Oh yeah, get something out of balance and at those speeds.
Yeah, that's all she wrote.
So when we were talking about, I guess we can talk about the magnetic fields, which is essentially what drives a motor. the mixture of the brushes, the commutator, and the coils. Again, the coils be the copper wire coming off the commutator, wrapping around the armature arm, and then returning to the next commutator over. That coil is an electrical coil. When electricity passes through it, it infers, I suppose, an electric charge, an electric field into the material that it is coiled around. In this case, the armature arm, part of the rotor. That electric field that is being generated within the rotor inside that coil is then acting upon the electric field, the electromagnetic field that's being generated by the two typically permanent magnets, sometimes electromagnets that are on the outer stator, or on the stator itself. So there's an electromagnetic field that's passing through the motor between those magnets, assuming we're talking about a two-magnet motor here. There's an electromagnetic field that's passing through the motor, and when you then induce a electromagnetic field from the coils into the armature arm, that then causes the armature to act on that field. There's a push and pull that occurs. One could say on a simple level that the armature arm becomes magnetized and is attracted to the magnet on the stator. Which is how
the south pole of the permanent magnet is attracted to the effective northern pole of the induced magnetic field. That's where everybody thinks about it, typically.
And for the purposes of understanding, is not too far from being right.
It's accurate enough to work with it.
Right. What's actually happening is the poles of the armature they don't orient quite that way, and this is getting to that level that I don't have a firm grasp on. So I'm going to talk about some stuff and then reference the two video materials, specifically the DC motor video that I've linked, because he talks about it in much better terms than I can. But when you induce that current, or you induce that magnetic field into the armature arm, the plane that magnetic field is on is different than the plane.
Is that the in and out plane? Like, so along the stator arm? Is that the plane you're referring to, or is it more the horizontal plane?
Let's just say that they're out of plane of each other, because I'm not entirely sure which direction that plane faces. What I do know is that the field being generated, and it depends on which way you're looking at, vertical, horizontal, and all that. Okay. Just know that the two are not on the same plane. They're not angled the same. And when that occurs, and you'd have to look. I think is it the Lorentz law that is the left hand with the three fingers pointing, middle finger in one direction,
Mm-hmm.
pointer finger straight out, thumb up. That comes into play to tell you which way the field's going. But essentially, on one side of the stator arm is being pulled up, the other one's being pushed down. And it's the same stator arm. Oh, sorry, not stator arm, armature arm. One's being pulled up, one's being pushed down, and that induces the rotation that you see. Again, that's sort of the level I don't have a ton of grasp on, but I saw it and I was like, I really wish I could grasp that one, so I could explain it. But definitely without getting a better idea of it myself, and then having it's one that I would almost have to see somebody in person to walk them through it, because it's going to be hard to say, and then this picture.
Yeah, magnetic fields are... I mean, that's obviously its own detailed field of study, and obviously critical to how all of these motors work. By inducing current as a coil around a piece of metal, it induces the effectiveness of a north-south of a permanent magnet, sort of. Like, it's not directly, but indirectly it is, right? Because it's orienting the free electron fields in the iron alloy core of the stator, and those are what's creating the north and south pull
the
push.
Armature.
Right. It's the armature, right. I'm sorry. Right.
No, it's fine. I'm doing my best to keep each part
You're good.
in the right position.
It's crazy. It's cool. It's awesome. And it's nice to finally, because we've gone so deep, it's nice to get a handle on it. Because I don't know, it used to be, I don't know, I anchored the thing, and I put stuff in it, and it spins a lot. And that's cool. And
it is. And, I remember making the childhood science experiment where I took a length of copper wire and wound it into a circle, and then wrapped that around the ends, and then had the two copper pieces sticking out, and then so you had a copper circle with two copper wires sticking out, one on each end, and you set that on conductors that had a little slot cut into them so that you could set the wire down onto there, and then you took all that and hooked it up to a battery,
right?
Typically AA, and when you connected, they spun. That said, there may have been something else involved in that, because now that I'm thinking about it, that would result in nothing happening.
Anybody could look up probably stem copper wire motor or something, and it'll probably come up with something very similar, and see how to make it yourself. But yeah, it's the same idea. I think my neighbor across the street had said, "Hey, you're an engineer. You come over and check this out. See if you can help my daughter do that exact experiment." And I'm like, "I'm not electrical. I'm a civil guy. Like, if it's a structure and you don't want it to break, I'm your guy. That's electricity." She's like, "Yeah, but you work for the power company." I'm like, "Aha, that's a misnomer. I work for the company, but I do not understand what we do." That's not entirely true. I do. And I was able to help her, but I'm with you, man. This is, we're, to me, we're a step away from it being magic in my head.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, magnets are just, I know they shouldn't be, but magnets in general, not electromagnets. I can get electromagnets because there is power going into the system, therefore an effect is happening. Permanent magnets are like, what is this magic? Why? Like, is that not a force that needs fueling? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah, how is that just there?
Yeah, but I get that, again, magnetism is electromagnetism, so there's something on the atomic level that's happening.
It is,
so I get it, but I started out in college as an electrical engineer, but I only took a semester, and then for potential opportunities that I was looking at the time, I switched. I needed to switch my major, and I switched to business. So I'm actually a business major. But I was raised.
Now I'm doubly sorry.
yeah, I was raised a jack of all trades, so I get some things. And this I definitely went in and did some research on. And there's a couple more points to cover with this one.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can hear it.
Yeah. So one of the things that you and I talked about when we were discussing motors, especially brushless motors, was with the rotor, with the armature. There was the rotors and armatures, and you're referencing a magazine, I know, so I'll let you.
We'll get into that when we get there, yeah.
But the rotor or armature is made up of multiple, many thin plates of iron
alloy.
Composite alloy. There we go.
Yeah, I have a list of actually what it's an iron nickel alloy.
Okay. But it's thin plates of that are cut identically, stacked, that make up the armature. Now, each of these plates are electrically isolated from each other, such that they do not conduct across each other. And that is handled by a laminate. Could be a lacquer, or you referenced a dielectric.
Dielectric just means it doesn't conduct electricity. That's all.
Oh, see, look at you using these fancy terms.
Well, that's what happens when you work with electrical engineers for too long.
I'm over here looking at food costs, man.
I know, right? Look, according to the magazine, and we'll get into the details of like specifically what it is, AMA magazine, but specifically to this article, they're saying that each of the sheets is 0.2 millimeters thick. So just so you get a handle on how many plates that means your 10 millimeter motor is. There's a ton of them. Yeah.
0.2 millimeter. 5 to a millimeter, 10 millimeter rotor would be 50, but then you got to take into account your laminate distance, and in as much as they want to electrically isolate those the various plates, they also want them as tightly packed as they can be, so they get as much of that. What we're going to talk about in a minute, but you get as much of the magnetic field as you can, or as many of those. So they got to be close, but not touching. So instead of 50, you might have 40.
Not electrically touching, right? So that can be accomplished with as simple as just a spray coating. So it's a millimeter, it's a micron thick coating on each of the layers that's creating this electric separation. So it's not much. So thankfully, but it still needs to be there, because without it, you're hosed.
Right. Yeah, so the question, and why we were looking at that and we found that interesting, is why are they multiple plates? Why are they all these individual plates separated, stacked together, individually laminated but stacked together? Why not just one solid core?
Exactly.
And good question. In doing the research for that, bear with me on this one, Matthew. No, in doing the research on that, the other part of the conversation that came up was, well, why is it a conductive material? Why would we not use a non-conductive material for the armature? Could we not just use something else? And so in my Googling, I actually came across an interesting thread, which was, why don't we use wood for making armatures? And I was like, okay, it's not cast iron or anything like that that's non-conductive, but wood works. Why don't we use wood? And then once I read the answer, I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. The magnetic field that the motor is using to induce to turn itself is not the magnetic field that's coming off of the wires themselves. So when electricity flows through a wire, you do get a small magnetic field off of it. When you wrap those wires, you can then, into a coil, you can then stack those fields and get a stronger field. But what's more important,
it amplifies the effect.
Right. And what's more important is to get that field to drive a bigger field in a conductive material, something that can be magnetized. And so those coils wrapped around the armature arms are then inducing a larger magnetic field in that armature arm than just the wires themselves would have. Plus, it gives the wire something to attach to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you use just wood for the armature, you really wouldn't have anywhere near as powerful a motor because you're relying on the electric field generated by the wires, not
Alone.
the electric field that you're not the electric field that you're inducing into the rotor or the armature arm.
So the material that the electric coil, the copper wire is wound around, is also adding to that magnetic field that's generated by the current in the wire.
Yes.
So we're
effectively
right. We're effectively stacking the effect of the magnetic field induced by the flow of electricity through the motor itself, through the your I want to say stator, but through right. Because stator staying still, that's where the wires are wrapped around. Is that true?
No.
Okay, right. In the DC, it's like the opposite.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, in your brushless build, the stator has the copper coils.
Right. Okay. So, but where the copper coils are, the coils are making a field, and that field is creating a field from the iron that it's wrapped around. So the iron itself is generating a field. Because everything in the iron is aligning to the field. So it's adding its own magnetism, induced magnetism, to the field that's being generated. So the two of them are working together to make a stronger field.
I want to say yes, but
gotcha. Okay,
that is getting to just right there at that point that I'm not at.
I'm with you.
But so that explains why we have to use a conductive material, not wood. Which again, now we'll look at it, I'm like, why did I click on that link? I should have known better. But I'm like, oh, man, I feel dumb for just bringing that one up. But you know what? Since we're on the conversation,
no, let's go deep, man.
Yeah, let's. Why can't we use wood? Oh, well, that makes sense. By its nature, a rotor / armature arm needs to be conductive to be able to accept and generate that magnetic field.
Okay, so we now know why it's an iron core.
Yeah, but why
is it many plates? Yeah, what the heck's with that?
And this one is also sort of right there at the edge of I kind of get it, but I kind of don't. So when you induce a magnetic field in a conductive material, now we'll keep referencing armature arm, and again, when I say an armature arm, I'm talking you've got the rotor, the turning bit. The armature arm is the arm that sticks out that the copper coil is wrapped around. That's the arm part of that armature.
Right.
When you induce an electromagnetic field in the armature arm, that's then going to act on the magnetic fields generated by the permanent magnets positioned on the stator. Once the motor turns far enough or spins far enough that the commutators then disconnect from the brushes.
And for a very small split second, right?
Depending on the speed of the motor, yes. Right. I mean, it's really fast anyway, but
we'd never be able to detect it. But it's enough where it's separating the one field generated by when it hits the next commutator. What happens?
So depending on how many, I don't want to say phases,
poles?
But how many coils, poles, sure. How many coils you're working with? How many sets of coils you're engaging at one time will determine how long a coil is disconnected. Now, obviously at high speed, it's really fast regardless of if you have 3 coils or if you're running, 100 coils. And I reference 100 or more coils because there are motors that are that big that have that many commutators and that many coils in them.
With that many is that they reference they call them turns?
No.
Okay, that's a different thing.
That's a different thing.
Okay, got it. Go ahead. Keep going. You're
turns are the number of loops within the coil.
Got it. That's good.
I believe.
That's fair.
I believe.
That's fair.
I wanted to research turns more before we did this episode, and
it's okay. I tried. It was hard.
To that point.
I tried, and it's a poorly documented subject as far as I could find. I'm sure somebody's going to prove us wrong. By all means, write us an email. Let us know. aviationrcnews@gmail.com. Let us know. We'd love to hear what we could have gotten better, and we'll help you listeners by letting everybody know what it is. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah.
So
the reason that I say that the turns is not equal to the coils, and I'm going to reference RC Plane Lab here because I remember listening to this part of their segment, and it's the number of times that wire wraps in that coil. It's not how many coils you have.
Okay, so the coils are effectively the number of stator arms or the number of armatures.
Right. So armature arms or stator arms.
Okay, got it. Okay, we're good.
Yeah. Again, could be wrong, but this is my current understanding of it. And then
the magnetic field was going one way. The commutator got to the gap. It stopped flowing electricity. The magnetic field stops. It moves to the next segment. At least the one induced by the flow of electricity.
It begins to decay, yes.
Right. But there's still the stuff in the iron, so that's still happening.
Oh, okay. Yes, the electromagnetic flow within the wire stops.
It's gone. But the one in the iron is still holding.
It's still there.
And then it meets the next piece of the commutator. The brushes go to the next piece, and what happens?
So that induced field is still there. It begins to decay. But it's not gone completely. Anybody done the experiment where you run a magnet down your scissors, and your scissors are electric or magnetic?
Yep, and it stays that way for a while, yeah.
Yeah. So the armature arm will retain its field. It may not be I imagine it's not the strength that it was when it had the electric coil running, but it's still retaining some of that.
Right.
The commutator advances, the brushes lose contact with those commutators, the electricity in that coil dies off, the motor is onto a different coil, doing different things. As then the motor continues to turn, the commutators then continue to advance until they come into contact with the opposite brush of what they were.
Okay.
And I guess I should say that.
So we're, from the point of view, we're hanging out on the commutator as it spins.
We could say the brushes are turning around us, sure.
Right, but effectively we're spinning. But to us, it looks like the brushes are moving.
Yeah, that's
not
so important. Just know that just know that there's a induced field that in the armature arm that's kind of hanging out, is decaying, but it's still there, and that
commutator
the motor advances. Commutator that commutator will go around until it comes into connection with the next brush. And I should mention, and I should have said this on the front end, which is that in order for that loop to complete, the electricity goes from one brush through the commutator, through the coil, to the commutator on the other side, so they can then have a DC out.
The opposite, and then that's the loop, so it goes back out. Okay, so that's the flow.
Yeah.
Got it. Go ahead.
And I should have said that, but got caught up in it. So when it advances far enough that then it comes into contact with the opposite pole of the electricity, or the other brush, then the electrical flow reverses. So you had a coil set up from the copper coils, energized, had set up. They had a north pole pointing in one direction. The motor advances, it loses the electrical charge, it continues to advance due to other coils being engaged and acting on the field, and then that armature and coil come into contact with the other brush, and the flow is reversed. When that happens, the electrical flow within the wires is reversed. They flip instantly, because electricity was flowing or not. So it flowed, it stopped, now it's going the other way. When that happens, you are then trying to induce a new magnetic field onto the armature arm.
Right, you're putting a new magnetic flux onto this existing one, trying to reverse it.
Right, you're trying to reverse it, and this is where we get into eddy currents, which,
Eddie,
yeah,
what you done for me lately?
not on, and in as much as we're not talking about fluid dynamics, these eddy currents, as I understand, if they were to be graphed or pictured, are not unlike eddy currents in a river.
They behave effectively like a fluid, even though
it's a magnetic field.
It's not a fluid we normally think of as a fluid.
Don't think too hard. Don't think too hard on that one.
I'm going to let you breeze right through that. Go ahead.
Yep. Here we go. So the eddy current is sort of that current that's remaining that is now going to fight against the new field that you're trying to induce upon it.
Okay.
And so that eddy current will result in a bit of a lag time, which I know you may or may not touch on when you get into your brushless discussion.
No, you know what? I may not do too much of it. If we cover it here, I may just leave it out and just reference this. So keep going. You're hitting it.
Yeah, this one's deep. So those eddy currents are then present, and they're fighting against the new field that's trying to be generated, or is generated in the copper coils, but the copper coils are then trying to push into or generate in the armature arm.
Right.
So that is, if the eddy current fights so long or so hard, you have so hard a time flipping the polarity of the field that's in that stator arm, then your motor is going to lose efficiency, because when it comes, the reason it's flipping the polarity of that field is so that it's now acting in the opposite direction in the field. You started at the north magnetic pole of the stator. You had a field that caused it to pull and twist past that. Now you're coming to the south pole, but you're aligned in such a way that it's going to fight going against that south pole rather than push its way through due to magnetics. So
the full power of the field is delayed by a small amount of time.
Yeah, and I couldn't tell you the equation for that.
No, please don't. We don't need everybody to go to sleep.
Again, reference the DC video that we'll link in the show notes, because he does a much better job explaining this than I do, and he's got the visuals to go with it. But when all this to get to the question of why do we have why is the plates or the stator in a brushless, why are the rotor plates in a DC motor or a brushed motor, why are they thin plates as opposed to a solid piece? And the reason for that is when you have a large single piece that is the armature and the armature arm, that is the electromagnetic field inside that then has that whole that whole solid core to be within. It's a larger field that you then have to flip. When you break that core into those tiny thin little plates, laminate them and stack them together, and laminate it so that they're not touching electrically, they then are isolated from each other as far as their fields go. As far as when the fields are being able to do something, they're not allowing the field they're not passing the flow in and amongst each other. I know this is going to be weird. Go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is, so it sounds like the strength of that eddy current resisting the change of magnetic field its relation is to the thickness of the plate itself. So the thicker the plate, the more power that eddy current has, or the more effectiveness it has. So by reducing the thickness of the plate that the field is running through, to change it, the eddy currents have less power, and thereby the change in field is quicker and more efficient.
Correct. Essentially, yeah. That's what I was trying to get to. A bit
You did it
in
right.
as
You did
many
it right.
as
That's what I was thinking. But it's a function of thickness. So
yeah,
the
it
thinner the
really is.
plate, the thinner the plate, the less power the eddy current has to resist the change.
Right. If you had a solid core or a solid piece, then there's this big field that you're working on trying to flip. Versus
Mhm.
if you have a bunch of little plates, you have a bunch of little fields that you're flipping.
Right.
And the size of the field, this is I'm going to take a leap here, but I think this is accurate, especially when you look at the diagrams of how the electric fields or the electromagnetic fields pass through the engine and how they interact on each other. The fields that you're inducing on the armature in brushed or stator and brushless do not have to be big fields, because any field that's extending outward beyond the scope of the motor is wasted field energy. So
Mhm.
that's they're looking for small plates so that the fields are small and they're easier to flip. And if they're easier to flip, it happens faster. Therefore, you don't have loss power or excess energy being used trying to flip. And like you say, the motor is more efficient.
So what? But what are the eddy current? Do you know what the eddy currents do? Like, like we obviously you don't want them because it decreases efficiency. But what happens to that efficiency? Like, right, energy can't be lost, so it's got to go somewhere. What happens to it? Do you know?
Um.
I mean, the article kind of mentions what happens, but
Okay.
if you
Then
happen to know, I want to let you tell the tale.
I'm not exactly sure which answer you're going for, or that I have the correct answer. So I will let you answer that.
It just basically says that the eddy currents and the kinetic energy in that change, um, it turns into heat, so it converts into undesirable heat. Because
Okay.
so if it's too much too often, you're going to have a motor that burns up, right?
Right. That's what I thought, but I didn't want to say that and then be wrong.
No, that's fair enough.
So,
That's fair enough. And again, that's per this article. It's an article in AMA magazine, May 2020, on page 27. I'll go into the credits when I get talking about it because I'll
yeah.
mention some other things. But yeah, it's the same in both motor types, and understanding that, while maybe not important to figuring out which motor you want to choose or what the heck all those numbers mean, um, I think it's helpful in understanding that there's a lot more that goes into making these things run efficiently. Because at a certain point, it's a balancing act, and it depends on what you want. And I think that goes with almost every single motor you've ever run into.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's where I'm glad that we have motor designers who
Yeah.
you can just say, I want a thing with a ton of torque, or I want something that goes uber fast, like those little drones. I need this motor to go crazy fast because the propeller is tiny, and it's got to move enough air to get this thing in the air. So do you have something that goes crazy fast? And I'm like, okay, a big motor is never going to get there, but I've got an idea, And then they create these 80/20 motors or these little tiny can motors.
Mm-hmm. And what two more points I want to cover with brushed,
Please,
and
please.
I'll let you have it.
Uh-oh.
Is okay. So I know I said two, but then I lost my train of thought. And then I remembered them both, but one doesn't seem as important as it did. One thing I want to cover real quick, and then you can go on to brushless, is when you were talking about what happens with those eddy currents and what's undesirable at times about them, and you said the heat that's generated. Um, this knowledge has been in place for a while. It's only recently that we've really made use of it, I guess. or at least as far as automobiles go. One thing that eddy currents can be utilized for is regenerative braking, specifically taking the the braking properties of the eddy currents and regenerating power off of that. So you've had power tools, I'm sure, that you run them up, they're doing their work, and when you shut them down, they might take forever to wind down. I know my table saw does. My table saw takes a while to wind down.
Yep.
But my chop saw, and I guess it might also be called a miter saw, but I don't think it's quite a miter saw. But my chop saw, when I kill the power to it, it spins down for a while, so I think it's, definitely got some age on it, and it does. But it'll spin down for a while, and then once it reaches a certain point, then the brake kicks in. And as I was looking and researching this, they talked about utilizing the eddy currents to also slow an engine or slow a motor down in the case of power tools. So if you've got a tool that runs at high speed, you kill the power, it runs for a while, as it starts to slow down, and then something seems to it kicks in and just really ramps it down. Could be the use of eddy currents to brake, which is essentially, I don't know a whole lot about this one, but they're utilizing the residual magnetic field, and they might actually be utilizing alternating magnetic poles positioned around the armature and rotor to induce and then drag magnetic fields within the rotor to slow it down. Because anytime that armature is in the presence of the field, it's magnetic, or it can be magnetized, so it's going to accept that field, and then once it accepts it, it moves to the next field that's dragging on that field because the eddy current's still there,
and it's slowing it down. And remember, every motor, when run the opposite way, is a generator. So every motor can be a generator. If you're pushing current through it to run it, it'll spin, right? But if there's no current and you spin the motor, so let's say there's whatever is on the shaft has inertia and is going anyway, it's actually acting as a generator and generating current through the wire. So if you stop the flow, you're basically allowing it to slow down. And that's essentially literally what wind turbines and things like that are. Is they're an opposite of them. They're essentially just one big motor. They're just running the opposite way. They're letting the wind power spin the shaft, and that generates electricity because those are still magnets around it generating fields. Those fields are pushing a field at the wire, and that field pushes current through the wires itself, and it generates electricity. So essentially, if you're not running it one way, if you're going the other way, it's a generator. That's all. It's the same principle, just opposite direction.
Now, I may be wrong.
That helps.
I know that you can utilize a DC motor as a generator. And you can test that, grabbing a little LED, hooking it up to a DC motor, and spinning it. You may have to really crank at it, but you can get it to, and the little bicycle lights. I had that as a kid, where I had the little the lamp that mounted on the front, and then the little generator, you flip it down and it engages the tire because it's got a little rubber wheel on it, and it spins, and it would spin up that light.
Yeah, and you got to work extra hard now.
While the reverse principle is true, I would like to think, and I'm fairly certain, that generators have a different build to them. While they utilize the reverse concept, the construction is different in key components to be able to hold up to that.
Of course. I mean, there are other aspects to it that are different, but the core principles are identical. They're just running in opposite directions. One pushes the rotor, and the other one, the rotor's turning and pushing electricity, which would, depends on what direction you want to go. So I know I've got a 3D printer, and when I move the bed, it generates electricity in the motor enough to power the panel, even though it's powered off. So
So
the
what, the
LED
light will
panel,
turn
I
on?
mean, yeah, no, the LED panel that actually it actually gets enough current and enough voltage pushed back through it by me moving the bed back and turning that motor so much, it's generating
Hmm.
enough electricity to power on basically the breadboard again because it doesn't require
Okay.
a lot of electricity. So what it'll do is starting up again, even though I'm just moving the bed.
Hmm.
So again, they always, not always, but most
I kind of figured
motors
there'd be,
are.
like resistors and diodes in place to prevent that such occasion, so you don't knock your 3D printer and suddenly there goes your circuit board.
It depends on how cheap. It's not a lot of current, so I don't think they're worried about it.
Yeah.
But trust me, my 3D printer is on the cheapest of cheap. So,
Yeah.
anyway, we won't get into that. We're here to talk about motors. So,
Yes.
so how do I figure out, like, how do you select motors that are DC? I mean, I can talk about the really tiny ones, but and maybe that's
I
all we need to talk about.
Yeah, those are answers I don't have for you. Um, I can
Okay, that's
I
okay.
can I can tell you that, like, if I were to try to replace a motor in, say, my drill,
Mm-hmm.
then I I don't know if I can find any documentation on my power drill, so I'd go out there. I'd if I need to replace a motor, I might rip it open, pull the electric motor out, and look for numbers on the side and try to match those up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't know what those numbers on the side mean. I'd have to Google them myself. But what I would definitely want to do is look at the voltage that motor is receiving, because
Right.
I'm sure the motor is not receiving straight 120 volt, uh, however many amps it wants to draw, which can't be but like what 10 tops, because
Yeah, it's not much.
20 tops, because socket you kind of got breakers in place for that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I would be looking for the voltage of the motor, how many amps it could draw, thus voltage and amps.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give you a wattage component.
Yeah.
Largely, if I were to have to look for a motor for my power tools, I'm looking for an identical motor. Like, I'm just going
Uh,
to pull numbers off of it, go looking
yeah.
for it. But like, I don't know anything about them for
Airline.
RC.
Yeah.
That would be a lot of research I have to do.
No,
Now,
don't worry about it. But that's a safe bet. What you're suggesting is a safe bet. If you have burned out a motor or you want to use a motor, look at something similarly sized and see what it uses, and use something similar. Like pick the same motor and use it for, if it's a 20-inch aircraft. If you've got a 20-inch aircraft, you find another aircraft that uses a DC motor and say, oh, okay, cool, I can use that. A lot of the DC motors that are used in RC aircraft um, are typically one cell lipo type, maybe two, but typically only one. Um, if it's brushless, sorry, if it's brushed, it's typically 3.7 volts to 4.2, and the currents are really small.
mm,
We're talking, 2 amps maybe. And then the way they're typically, at least the ones that are the really small motors, they are measured in millimeters by the diameter of the can and the height of the can. So an
mm,
80/20 motor, which is a pretty good size motor, it is 8 millimeters in diameter and it's 20 millimeters long, which is pretty cool because you can use that to design the space to put them in, like, pretty accurately.
mm,
Um, and they typically range, the ones that I've seen that are effective for airlines and airplanes and things like that are 6 by 16 up to 10 by 20. And after that, at that point, you're kind of looking at brushless is a better fit. The cool part about it is they use very little current. They're not super strong, but if you can, they go really fast. So if you can torque down the motor, if you can basically use gearing to change the speed, you can get basically a low angle 5-inch motor to pull your plane, and it draws almost no current. So you've got like a very small battery lasting 10 to 15 minutes. And whereas if it were brushless, you would have been out of battery a long time ago because it's pulling a lot more current.
mm.
So that's the one advantage. For example, if you look at the FT stem stuff, the FT freighter, I've got the Banggood version of it. It it'll fly for 10 minutes. It's got two, I think they're 716 motors, 0716 motors, and that's a 7 millimeter diameter by 16 millimeter can. There's two of them, and so you've literally got two motors running 70% draw, and it's a 150 milliamp battery lipo, and that
Mm-hmm.
150 milliamps lasts for 10 minutes. So I
Jeez.
don't know what kind of current. I didn't do the calc, but it's tiny. So we're looking at like 1 amp compared to like brushless size will typically be 4 to 6 amps or 4 to 5 amps. So that's a significantly different amount, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Again, but they're never really going to pull. They don't have a lot of torque, so they're never really going to pull as much as is needed for the larger airplanes. So we stopped there, and then we looked at brushless.
Well, before
Uh,
we get into brushless,
yeah, I was going to say, did you have anything else to add to the brushed conversation?
uh,
I'm sure you do.
last thing, and it's not so related to this conversation. It was a story that came to mind.
Mm,
Just to break up some of the dryness of our parts discussion. You were talking about replacing a DC motor. And like, yeah, you want to find the motor that is very similar, exact specs, or as close. Well, I say, yeah, DC brushed motor.
mm-hmm.
That's what I'm talking about. Um, and I'm sure you had one of these for your boys. When I was very young, my parents had got me one of those electric four wheelers,
Okay.
little plastic ones with a little DC
Yeah, yeah,
motors in them.
yeah. I
It
got
had
one for my
it
kids.
had some smaller DC motors in them and some whatever battery packs they were using. And apparently as a kid, I loved that thing, which I can believe. But I'd ride that thing nonstop and
Mm-hmm.
run it into the ground. Well, eventually I had worn the batteries and the motors out. And I still wanted to ride it. And so Dad, being the jack of all trades that he is, said, "You know what? I'm going to fix my boy's electric four wheeler," and he did. And in the process, said, "You know what? He's getting an upgrade." he didn't go back in with the motors or the battery that was there.
Oh boy.
He had to do a little bit of cutting and work on that frame to put in the bigger motors and the bigger battery that he put in that thing. And as I understand it, that little electric four wheeler would flat boot and scoot.
You had a drag racing four wheeler.
As a kid, just he upgraded the motors, and that's the difference it can make. But especially with that power behind it of a bigger battery, man, they talk like that little thing would move. Now, I mean, as fast as you're going to let a 3-year-old or 4-year-old or however I was cut loose on an electric four wheeler, a little plastic thing, but they thought like that thing would move for what it was.
Yeah,
and I just loved it even more.
I know,
even
right?
more.
Your
And
dad was a hero.
yeah, my dad's over there like, yeah, get it, boy. And my mom's over there like, he's going full speed through the through the gate opening. He's like, he's got it.
Oh my god, that's funny.
Yeah. But so yeah, definitely for that reason, make sure if you're replacing, you go with the one that you had, unless you're specifically looking for an upgrade. But then you gotta take into account the consequences of that. But anyway,
Excellent.
brushed. Yes, you. And in case we didn't say it, I think we did. But yes, you can change out the brushes. The bearings are sort of the ultimate failure on a brush motor. If the bearing gives out, as far as I know, it's pretty much toast. Brushes you can replace.
Okay, good.
All right.
Thank you.
Brushless.
Brushless motors, right? So at a certain point, I'm trying to remember. Well, okay, so the difference between a brushed and a brushless motor tends to be, as far as usability, the lifespan of a brushed motor is much less, or at least noticeably less than a brushless motor. Because when we start looking through a brushless motor, you'll realize that the only thing that is moving on these is the only thing that's moving against one another is a bearing. So basically,
Hmm.
you have, just like any other motor, you have a stationary part and you have a rotating part, and in a brushed motor, you have the commutator and the brushes that are contacting each other, and they're spinning like mad, and they're touching. Well, in a brushless motor, it's exactly like it says. There's no brushes, um, and we'll talk about how it conveys its power. But basically, the only thing that the rotating part connects to in into the stationary part is the bearings.
Hmm.
And the way they've got the bearings is the bearings are um, nowadays that's really the difference between like a low quality and a high quality motor. There's a lot of other differences too, but the big thing that kind of stands out is that low quality motors have lower quality bearings. They'll wear out sooner than high quality bearings. That said, and high quality motors. That said, the bearing still lasts an awful long time, way longer than any brushes ever do. And so thereby, brushless motors tend to last overall like probably more than the life of almost any plane you'll ever run into. Honestly, you're probably going to damage it from crashing before you actually have the brushless motor wear out in any capacity. So why don't we talk about how the brushless motor functions and the different parts, which are going to be
Hmm.
very similar to brush. So I'm not going to probably go into too many details because we've already
I think
talked
it's
about a
just
lot of us.
the rearrangement of some of the parts.
Exactly. So the way a brushless motor works is that the inside is what's connected to your plane. That remains stationary. Around the center, around this stationary piece is the stator. And it looks like the octopus arm sticking out, and that's where all the electricity coil, all the electrical wires coiled around. That's the thing that generates the field. Um, and we talked about that. And we'll get into more details. So basically, this is stator, those iron plates, they're connected together, and the electric wires coiled all around. And then around that, sitting um, on the shaft and connected to the shaft that's connected to the propeller is a bell that has the permanent magnets glued into it all around the outside. So that bell and the shaft spin, and they typically have bearings that go through the anchor point and the stator. Um, so that bell spins like crazy, but there are no pieces that are touching one another except for the bearings.
Right.
That's literally the only thing that connects the two pieces together effectively. Um, because of this, um, and the fact that they're using um, the other difference is that brushed motors are DC motors. It's a direct current in, it goes through, it makes the thing run, and it comes back out. Brushless motors are effectively AC motors. So it takes a DC in, there's a speed controller that converts it to AC, and it basically sends three different phases of electrical current through three different coils, three different coil sets. Um,
Hmm.
let's see. Anyway, so that's the basic overview. So what you'll and then the biggest thing to tell between the differences, you pick up a motor you bought on a at a swap meet and you go, what is this, a brushed or a brushless? Brush motors have two wires coming out, and brushless will have three. It's pretty simple. And think of it kind of like a triangle that each phase it's going in one, two, three, one, two, three, one, two, three, and that's kind of how the motor spins around. You may have many multiples of three, so it goes one, two, three, one, two, three, one, two, three, one, two, three, one, two, three to come back to the first one, right? So
Hmm.
that'd be like four sets. Um, anyway, but either way, they're typically in sets of three. The cool part about that is if you reverse two of those wires, now it's going one, to going counterclockwise instead of clockwise, let's say. And now you've reversed the direction of the motor. By switching to those wires, you've changed the direction. The wires, I mean, it's still flowing from 1, 2 to 3, but now the direction is going to flip. So it's really easy. Like if you put on a propeller and you realize you forgot I put on an R. So it's going the wrong direction. Shoot. So you can take out, or I plug it in and I wired it wrong. Well, all you got to do is switch 2 wires and now it's going the right direction. So that's a neat little function of a brushless motor. So I think what I'm going to start off is kind of go over what you need to know, like how to make sense of some of these numbers. And then we'll kind of go into the details of its operation. And again, we covered a lot of it with the brushed motors and how they operate, and we'll kind of touch on how they're different in brushed motors. Talked a little bit now, but we'll go into more detail. So when you see a motor, you'll see 2306. For example, I'm looking at an Emax Eco Series 2306 2400 kV motor. It's a 12N 14P. What? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? I know when I started, I went, "What? That's a lot of numbers." I think the CPAC motor was originally a 2218 -09 what the heck is an Emax motor. It had a GT series.
Oh.
Well, usually if there's like a letter in front of it, that's some sort of demarcation for the manufacturer itself. So,
Hmm.
like the manufacturer might have an A series and a B series. Oftentimes it's like GP, like a Grand Performance or Extra Fast or whatever, and they'll do an abbreviation, and that's what goes in front. The next set of things will probably be 4 numbers. So they're almost always 4 numbers, and those 4 numbers, while not not uniform across every single motor, oftentimes what they reference to is the diameter and height. They're basically those 4 numbers are two digit numbers. They're referencing the diameter of the stator and the height of the stator. And the stator is what those coils are wrapped around, if you remember. And
Hmm.
based on that size, that's going to give you the rough kind of estimate of how strong the field is and what kind of torque or how much force, like what distance the force you're going to generate is acting over, right?
Hmm.
So that kind of gives you, based on the size, you can kind of get a handle as to how much energy you're going to get out of this thing just at a quick glance. Okay. So it'll be 2306. So that means it's 23 millimeters in diameter and 6 millimeters high. That's the stator. Because if you go to Emax or somewhere like that and look up, they have a great, great level of detail. And if I recall, I'm looking to see if they have the actual diameter of the stator on their thing. And of course, no, it's 27.7 is the bell. And the height of the bell, I don't think it has it on here, but it looks like it's somewhere around 13, which is
So 20.
dramatic
You're saying 27.7 millimeter, which in
millimeters.
that case are what, rounding down for that number, or are they
No, I
rounding
mean,
up?
no. What I'm saying is that's the outside dimensions of the motor itself. So that's
Oh,
the
okay.
dimensions of the bell. So you can say, okay, well, that doesn't make any darn sense. But the 2306 is the dimensions of the stator. Now, some motors, especially if it's like a brushless outrunner, it's going to measure the outside diameter of the bell. But generally speaking, when you're looking at like if you're looking at like something that can pull a 10 to 12 inch propeller and sometimes on up, you're going to have this configuration. It's going to be a couple letters for the manufacturer. It's going to have 4 digits. That's essentially two-digit numbers, which will identify the rough size of the stator. And
Hmm.
then you'll have a 2300 kV or 2300 kV or whatnot. And you're like, well, what the heck does that mean? What is 2700 kV? So that is basically a denote. It's an equivalent way to measure the rough power of the motor, and that's basically saying it or the rough speed of the motor. It will run 2700 revolutions per volt. of energy put into it.
Per minute.
Now, then what you'll do is if you look at the motor, and that's the other thing you're going to want to look for, every motor should tell you what kind of power it can accept. And it'll probably do it in lipo cell voltages. So remember, every lipo cell is going to be 3.7 volts. So for every cell, you're adding um, an additional 3.7 volts. So a 2 cell is a 7.2 volt motor, or 7.4 volt max. A 3 cell is going to be 11.1 volt max, or on average.
Because you're
Sorry,
talking
on average.
average.
Average voltage is 3.7, because the range of a lipo battery is 3.3 to 4.2. 4.2 is fully charged. It's
Okay.
fully charged. It puts out 4.2 volts. On average, it's going to be 3.7 volts. So let's get that clear. And then, so for every volt, you're getting that much more on average put through the thing. So the motor is going to tell you how much it can handle, because at a certain voltage, the components won't be able to handle that much power going through the wires, or maybe even the stator itself can't handle that much, that powerful a magnetic flux motor changing so fast. It'll create, as we talked about earlier, it generates heat as a byproduct of
Hmm.
of its resistance to changing the flux. That will end up basically heating up the stator core, and it'll probably expand so much that the stator itself will expand into the permanent magnets on the bell, because there's a very tiny gap.
Right.
We're talking like fractions of a millimeter, very small fractions of a millimeter
Oh,
distant.
I didn't know it was that tight.
Yeah, it's awful tight. I mean, we're talking probably 1/100th of a millimeter, I think, or less.
Whew.
And on the really good motors, it's smaller, right? The great motors are closer. The lower quality motors have a bigger gap. But anyway, so what you'll have is, if that stator expands or heats up too much, it's going to expand. It could even possibly expand into the magnets themselves. So that's obviously no good. You want to make sure you're staying within that manufacturer's window. Sometimes you can go higher. Typically, when you do that, what you're doing is you're degrading the components faster. So it might be able to handle a couple extra cells voltage, but typically if it does that, it's probably going to run far shorter, and it'll basically burn out the components. The wire itself or the coating will burn off. It'll generate too much extra heat, and it'll be done. You'll basically fried your motor, literally. Um,
Hmm.
Maybe not literally, because you're not putting it in a fryer, but you're frying the coating, cooking it off. So anyway,
Which
all
then
right.
then you got shorts going on.
Yeah, and then right, exactly, and then it's all downhill from there. So you want to look at the number of cells. So if you think about it, let's say you have a 3 cell motor that's running at 11.1 volts. But for simple math, while we're talking, let's say you're basically putting 10 volts through it. If you have a 2300 kV motor at 10 volts, it's spinning at 23,000 revolutions per minute without any load on it. So that's saying without a propeller, it's not trying to move through the air, you're just spinning it anchored to the desktop. That's what you should see.
And I think that is an important distinction to make, that these KV numbers are specifically no load numbers.
It's very specifically, yes. And once you add a propeller and stuff, it's going to change. But it gives you a rough idea. If they're all measuring the same kind of KV, you're
Hmm.
generally seeing how fast whatever you put onto it is going to spin.
Hmm.
And you should also look. Some websites really don't have hardly any information about a motor. If you like what you see, that maybe the price or whatever on an outfit that you want to buy from, but it doesn't have any information, go look up that motor and see if you can find out the right information, because you're going to want to see what kind of propeller is it going to spin. They usually give you a range. The Emax Eco Series motor that I quoted here says it's 5-inch motor, or 5-inch propeller. Um, so it tells you how many cells of voltage. It says 3 to 4 cell. So you get a 3 cell lipo or a 4 cell lipo. So as you can see, as you go up in cells of voltage, so you put a 4S lipo, that thing's going to spin even faster. So instead of 23,000 volts, it's going to spin somewhere around 28,000 volts, or 28,000 revolutions per minute instead of 23. So that's a significantly, that's that many times more. That propeller is trying to cut through the air to give you thrust.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And when you're, and I had a question here, maybe I'll remember as I go, but when
sure.
you're talking about the load of a motor and the propeller that you're putting onto it,
Hmm.
um, oh, I wanted to ask you about the torque of these motors because while these numbers don't always indicate torque, you may have to open a data sheet, but a bigger, it just canceled
That,
that question.
that's okay.
That
The
I had a
higher that,
question about prop size versus torque of the motor, and high kV may not be
right, high
reflective of
K.
a high torque.
Well, it's actually typical. It's inverse. It's almost literally directly inverse. So the higher the kV, the lower the torque.
Okay.
So when you see a 340 kV motor, it has a very low torque, which means it's great at spinning a high load to whatever thing. It's going to be able to handle that load.
300, 300,
340 kV.
all right,
So
340 kV would be a low rotation, high torque.
right,
Yeah.
that's the kind of one that'll spin like a 14-inch or an 18-inch rotor.
Okay.
Okay. Whereas when you're looking at 2300 kV, which is almost a factor of 10 higher, that's spinning a 5-inch propeller or 6-inch maybe. And we won't get into it's a 5-inch, but it's not telling you what pitch. And oftentimes, even the good motors will have a whole set of propellers and a whole list of the voltages that what level of lipo you're putting in, and it'll
Mm-hmm.
give you information about how efficient it is, how many amps you can it's going to try and draw. Because remember, when you turn on the motor is going to spin at whatever thing it's going to pull as much electricity as it can, as it needs to get to that speed. If your speed controller cannot handle the kind of electricity flowing through it, those electrical components in the ESC are going to burn out, and then your motor system is effectively done for the day till you get a new one. But that's one of the things you should look at when you look at a motor. Pay attention to how many amps it's rated for. And this one, if you go down to the thing, you can see. Let's see. Um, there are two different kinds of motors it has. You can choose a 1700 kV, which is lower, which means it can spin a bigger propeller, and um, it's going to draw lower amps because it's assuming that one can take a higher cell voltage. So though it has a lower kV, so it has a lower revolution per volt, it's designed to take more volts from the battery. So it's effectively probably going to be spinning about the same. You're going to get a lot more thrust and a lot more power out of the motor from that. In this case, you're getting 800 watts. That's a measure of power. The current is going to be 32 amps, so it's going to be pulling less energy through because it's at a higher voltage. The amount of power is amps times voltage. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to draw less because it's more powerful, ultimately leading to a little bit more power. In the case of the higher rated motor, so the 2400 kV motor, so it spins faster per revolution. It can only take 4 cells, so you can't put as extra voltage into it, so extra oomph. Um, so to get the kind of speeds it needs, or to achieve the speeds it has to pull more amperage. So it has to pull more current through the motor, through the wires to generate the field, to generate the power. So you'll have
Mm-hmm.
42 amps at 4 cells. That's going to be a max power of 715 volts or 700 volts. So you have a reduction in power, but it might fit your application better. There's a whole thing. And what ends up you start realizing is all of this stuff is a big balancing act. So what I like to look at is I just check to make sure that I've got an ESC that meets the current draw that it's going to have. Um, that it's going to be able to connect to the battery I typically use. and that it's running, that I've got the propeller, right? That it's running the kind of propeller I want for the plane size I have. So if I've got a small plane, 5 inches fantastic. But if I've got a 40 to 60-inch plane, the 5-inch propeller, I don't care how steep you've got, is probably not going to pull enough thrust. And some of these things give you a thrust value, and if you get into it, there'll be a lot of arguments about how accurate the thrust value is. And all I can say is use the thrust values as a guide to give you a rough idea. Okay. Another thing to pay attention to is the prop adapter. So what diameter is the shaft that the propeller is going to go around? Because I think
that one becomes key.
Yeah, it's one thing that I almost forget every time. And then I go, oh, shoot, I better check that. Because why is that? Joe, you ran into it.
Yeah, so the motor that I got in the kit that I got from you that you had bought off a guy in the forums,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's the case for at least
A
for
lot
a
of
little while.
quadcopter motors.
Yeah, a lot of the flight test power packs, and I could be wrong about the current time, but at least that kit, it was more of a quad motor. And I did not know that when I was working with the props that I had. So
Right.
it had a prop that fitted great when I got the kit from you, and then it had some spare props that they didn't want to fit on the shaft quite right, and I wanted to look into prop savers specifically, so I wasn't, because what I was having to do was bore out the shaft hole in the prop. I was having to take a drill bit and hand.
Right.
I didn't want to hook it up to my drill press, but yeah, I was having that by hand bore it out, or I was taking my X-Acto knife
And scraping.
when I popped it in the field. I was like, let me just bore out some stuff, which
we
could get into imbalance props and all that, but I got it working.
No, right. It worked, but it worked ugly.
Right. So what I had there was a quad motor versus a normal airplane motor, which ended up having a shaft size that was different. So I was having to bore out airplane props to be able to fit on the quad motor. Also, because it's a quad motor, I couldn't get prop savers for it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The shaft is the wrong size completely. I could not find a prop saver that would fit that shaft. And then when I bought my replacement props, by that time I had figured out that I was dealing with a quad
motor. So typically quad motors have a 5 millimeter shaft, and where a lot of the traditional airplane motors of a similar size, we're talking Flight Test B and C pack, or 1000 kV or 1400 kV motors. Again, when you get into it, you'll start realizing what we're talking about. Hopefully this episode will help you. That level of size typically has, for airplane motors, traditional airplane motors, the shaft will be a 3 millimeter shaft or a 3.17 millimeter shaft. And then with that comes a number of options. They basically have a nose cone thing that sleeves over top of the 3 or 3.17 millimeter shaft. And then as you put the propeller on and tighten it up, it clamps the shaft, that smaller shaft, and it fits like a regular 4 millimeter or 5 millimeter propeller hole, right? And the propeller is the center hole. But with the quadcopters, they're all like 5 millimeters. So they don't typically work well with traditional airplane propellers.
Right. And I apologize for cutting out right there. I just quit talking because I had an alert pop up on my computer, and listeners don't need to worry about that. But it was a low hard drive space. I'm fixing it now, but.
So if Joe's recording goes out, now we know why. I'll see if I can finish out the episode.
Yeah, no, it should be fine. I'm clearing out some space. I've got a smaller SSD that's serving as my primary.
Yeah.
And it's filling up. It's good.
All right. Good. Okay. Okay. So now now we understand roughly what the motors are. So you pay attention to how many cells, all that kind of stuff. And I look at the thrust values if they're there. A lot of motors don't have that. Definitely pay attention to the shaft. Pay attention to what kind of lipo you can hook up to it. Very important. Make sure what current it's going to draw. Is it's going to draw that current? And oftentimes they'll give you a propeller that you can it's going to spin. It'll be let's say a 5x4. So that's a 5-inch diameter with a 4-inch per rotate. It's basically a thread pitch um, of the propeller's blade. So it will move forward 4 inches in one revolution. It's turned at an angle that if the once the propeller spins around once, it'll advance the plane 4 inches. That's what that's about. So
Okay.
if you're saying, but I don't want to use that one, I want to use something different, you can trade 1 inch of diameter for 1 inch of pitch. So if I have an 8x6 propeller that it's designed for, the motor says, hey, it works as a 8x6, but I've got a 7-inch prop, I can then use a 7-inch by 7 pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
I
as I
got you.
go smaller, I can add it to the pitch, or I can do a 9x4 or a 9x5.
Now, is
Right.
that
So as
it?
I get bigger, I can reduce the pitch of the motor. So it's trying to pull the plane less, and they end up being about equal. That's not entirely true, but it's
I was gonna say,
close enough.
is that on a linear slope, or does that begin
It's
to?
it becomes exponential pretty quick. But
Okay,
the point is within a 1 inch slide either direction, you
there's some leeway.
it's accurate enough where you can use that as your guide. Again,
Okay.
that'll tell you if your motor is going to work with the propeller you want, right? I've got a plane that's X size. They tell me an 8-inch propeller is what I want. I need to find a motor. Okay, let me find that motor. Okay. So I'm looking for a motor that can handle an 8-inch prop with the pitch I'm expecting to use. Cool, got it. Oh, wait, I can't use a 6-cell lipo. Oh, well, I can't use that motor. Maybe I need to find one that does, right?
Hmm.
So sadly, it's like pay attention to everything, but that's not entirely true. One of the things, but there's certain things you want to kind of pay attention to, and again, that number, that 2306 that we talked about,
Uh-huh.
that's just one of those things you can look at that and get a rough idea as to the general power range it's in. So you can weed out a bunch of motors you go, oh, I'll never need to look at that because that's either way too small or way too big. It's going to be way oversized. Again, planes only fly with so much weight on it. So if you get one of those giant motors, they're going to weigh 200 grams, where this little Emax motor we quoted is about 28 grams. So you get
Hmm.
a big motor, you're like, oh, it's going to pull everything. It's going to be great. Um,
You
your
need a bigger
plane
airframe.
your plane can't handle that. It's never going to produce enough lift to lift the thing off the ground, so it's useless, right? So
Well, even
that's
if it could, the initial firing up of that motor, a motor that size got to have some torque. You're going to flip
oh
your
my god.
plane sideways
Well,
just firing the motor up.
absolutely right, and that's again, I'm trying to avoid the whole talk about planes and torque, and that's something we'll talk about later when I want to cover an episode where we go through like how to design. What are some design guides on a plane? But yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. When you get some crazy big motors, now you're getting some crazy big power to turn that propeller, and it creates a bunch of torque. The torque is achieved. So basically, when you're on a table, you can anchor it and it stays put because everything weighs a ton and there's friction. It's not going anywhere. But in the air, when a plane is in the air, the only thing that's resisting the plane from counter turning is the air, and that's not a lot. So if you have too much torque, it's gonna twist the plane all around. You're gonna, like you said, flip the darn thing over. All right. Now, so we've talked about the things to look at when you're trying to find a motor, right? What do those things mean? Now we kind of talked a lot about it. The last thing to look at, and it's not a big deal, but it'll get into when we talk about how the brushless motors work differently from brushed, is it says a framework. You'll have a 12N 14p. So basically, n is the number of stator arms, and they're almost always divisible by 3, because remember we talked about it's a 3-phase power going into it. And what you end up having is power kind of going in and out. And it's a cyclical thing. It's kind of effectively circular. So you have this, what ends up being a sine waveform. It looks basically like a roller coaster going up over the hill and then back down in the trough. And what happens is you want to have steady current or steady voltage going through the wires to be able to create a consistent amount of turn. To do that, if you offset each of those, you have 3 roller coasters going, and as long as any one of those is up near the voltage you want, you're going to get what you want out of that, right? You're going to
Mm-hmm.
get the kind of power to turn the motor consistently. So if I have 3 different roller coasters offset just enough where by the time that last roller coaster is just coming over the top, I've got that first roller coaster coming back up again. Because again, it's going
Mm-hmm.
up over the hump, back down in the trough, back over the hump, and it goes back and forth. So when it gets that second trough of that first go around, if that third one is just finished going over the top, that first one should be coming back up again. So again, and what happens is you end up getting a consistent voltage during the entire set of rotational periods.
Or
So,
at least a more consistent. The
right,
fall off isn't as steep. And
exactly,
we're essentially setting up 3-phase power within this motor.
right, exactly.
Um,
And that's
because
done through the speed controller, which, if we have time, we'll talk about. If not, we'll talk about in the next episode. But yeah, that's essentially what it is. It's AC power.
and
Um,
real quick, I think what the 3 phases setting up here is that at any given time you've got 2 of those phases powered, and then it's just steady rolling.
hmm Yeah, effectively, yeah.
Okay.
And then the other thing is the P. It says 12N, 14P, and P is the number of magnets, or they call them poles. And those are on. Remember, they're on the outside of the bell. Okay. And the reason why I think we talked about it. I think there are almost always 2 more than the stator. The reason is you want the bell. You do not want the bell and the stators to be matched up entirely, because they're always going to want to push each other just a hair, right? So when one of the one of the stators, the electrical fields go, you want it to be not in line with each other. So it's either going to be pushed or pulled or get some sort of movement started always. All right. So, uh, so we've talked about, all right, let's go into the motor itself. We talked about that there's a bell. It's got a series of permanent magnets that are opposing poles next to each other, right? So the ones that are facing inward are south, then north, then south, then north, all the way
Mm-hmm.
around 14 times till they come back around. So again, they're always going to be, they should be even. Um,
Should, otherwise you wind up with a north and a north side by side.
yeah. And then
So
that'll
that's
mess
got to
up
be
your
divisible
flow.
by 2. Yeah.
That's always got to be divisible by 2. Okay. And so then what you have is you have your speed controller pushing power through every third stator effectively to pull this thing along. Remember, every third one is in the same phase. So
Mm-hmm.
you have the strong push in uh, every third stator, and then the other 2 are in a varying degradation of that power.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially like riding a tidal wave that's constantly rotating around this motor shaft. I mean, effectively, it's not actually going anywhere because the stator it's staying put, but the coils are activating in kind of a wave-like fashion. Imagine you're in the stadium and everybody starts putting their hands up and does a wave, and it starts going around. Now imagine you're basically riding that wave around. That's effectively what's happening with the motors
Okay.
through electric current. Okay. Um, so And again, it's running almost identically to the brushed motor. And the only difference is that there's nothing touching. There's almost nothing to wear out except the bearings. Um,
As I'm understanding it, the main thing, aside from there's the number of phases being different.
right.
In a brush motor, and I didn't talk about it, but a brush motor can have uh many more uh coils, say, than just the two poles. And it can have more magnets. Um, I suppose depends on how they set it up. But one of the videos I saw, like there was a brushed motor that it just had like 100 commutators in there. Like it was crazy.
Oh yeah,
Um,
and the same goes for brushless too. They can do quite a
but
number.
where the brushes and the commutator are what's handling the changing polarity of the coils, and thus the armature arms. That in a brushless motor, the ESC is handling.
The ESC is handling digitally in small, like tiny microchip electronic components.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed because I guess they're so small. All all of those changing are happening at microcurrents, and they happen super fast. Like we're microseconds or picoseconds are probably the appropriate level of timing. Um, and all they're doing is telling allowing the voltage power from the battery to go through each one of these different phases at a certain time. And all they're doing is just controlling when and where it goes through.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I would
um,
imagine, and this would have to be part of the ESC conversation, which at this point I want to say we're going to have to do in the next episode. But I would imagine that what you're referencing and the switching of, even though it's happening on micro level within the chips, I don't know, but I would imagine there's MOSFETs that are going on to
yeah,
actually switch the main higher voltage.
it's actually a combination of MOSFETs. Those are I'll call it, those are the workhorses,
Mm-hmm.
and also small logic gate circuits. We're talking like
Okay.
eight pin logic circuit kind of things,
Ooh.
and they kind of work hand in hand to um, basically do the if and statements and whatnot. Um, Again, we can get into those. I'm probably not going to get into a lot about the circuitry itself because I don't know too much. Although I know I've burned through a lot of the jackets because I've overheated and burned out my ESCs, so I've seen all those components. So I am aware that
You can certainly tell
there's
me what they look like.
yeah exactly right. And again, we'll talk about that next episode. So um, so we talked about all the stator is made up of all of these plates. The plates are typically a nickel iron alloy. And according to this article, let me talk about the article is in the May 2020 Model Aviation magazine that typically comes with your AMA membership if you have one. So you've probably seen it. If not, it's still free online for now. Joe, I shared that with you. So and I will put a link, and if you get to it soon enough, you should be able to look at it. And I highly recommend it. It's a really chock full of detailed information article, and it answered a lot of questions I was having in general about this stuff. Um, so one of the things, so they talked about, like, what kind of things cause this kind of electric motor to fail, and they basically say that for the most part, in brushless motors, the only thing that typically fails is the ball bearings are going to wear down,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the ones who are going to go. But we're talking along the lines of in like an automotive factory where they're run 24/7. In about 3 to 4 years, maybe the ball bearings will run out, right, and will wear
Right.
out. So in the RC application where your weekend warrior running it for what 20 minutes at a give and go, maybe even an hour, you should never see a failure in the ball bearings or almost any part of a brushless motor during the normal wear life. Now, if you tank it in the ground, it's possible you'll break the shaft or break it completely off in the case of the foamy bird of time. Um, so I mean that kind of stuff, like damage from outside stuff, or maybe you get it in the dirt and a bunch of grit gets in there. Um, one of the things that we were talking about, where the difference between like brushless motors and good brushless motors is that distance between, because the magnetic field forces are, I think it's at least an exponential decay with distance, if not more,
Yeah.
um, which means that it drops off incredibly fast with distance. So the closer you can get the permanent magnet to the stator core, the better. And the way you can kind of tell if it's a good quality motor is if you try and turn, because you should be able to spin the 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 bell of the brushless motor, and if it should spin. But if it almost like kind of click 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 click, and it's not like out of grit or something that's stuck between the two, that means that the magnet and the stator are so close together, that the permanent magnet is actually creating a small magnetic field on the stator itself, and
Hmm.
they're trying to keep together, which means they're awful close. That also means though that the power transfer is going to be incredibly efficient when your motor system is working. So that's a higher quality motor. Is
Okay.
something.
I thought you were leading the other direction with that because I was like, wait a minute now. When I grab my motor and turn it, I feel
Yeah,
that da 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 da. When I rotate that
yeah,
motor.
yeah. No, that's generally a very good motor. And I'm
Okay.
not saying that if yours spins somewhat freely, it should spin. You should be able to take the propeller and kind of spin it. Like I've got one right here, and if it spins, that's good. I mean, it should. That means that there's no grid or anything in it.
There's no
That
physical
might gum.
contact itself.
Right, and it's not. There's nothing gumming it up.
Hmm.
Like a piece of grass or something that somehow got in there. Um,
How hard did you tank it?
uh, remember, it's a 10-foot wing, running a 10-inch prop. So when I tanked in the nose, I guess the propeller dug in like I was trying to dig a latrine, and
Oh, nice.
and then the plane also hit the wing at the same time, so it started a cartwheel. So as the plane started to rotate over the nose, the propeller itself was dug into the ground solid, so it wasn't going anywhere, I guess. And so that 10-foot moment arm of the plane cartwheeling, was too much for the 3 millimeter diameter shaft or whatever it was,
Hmm.
and so it just completely
Sheared it
busted
right
off.
off. Yeah.
Yeah, it was impressive. I've never seen it before. It's tremendous.
Write that
It's
one down in the books.
well, let's just say I brought it out, and the guy who he actually was helping me, and he's like, "Oh, I have a bird time. These things are great. It's a little windy, so it might be a rough start." So we did it. It was clearly a rough start. Um, and yeah, he looked at it when I brought it back. He's like, "Oh, I haven't seen one of those in a long time." That kind of failure. So it's not common, but just know that crashes are potentially going to cause an issue. Um, so one of the things that I thought was interesting is this article covered heat, right? Everybody's like, "Oh man, that motor's running hot," right? And again,
Right.
that's where we talked about it's being generated by potentially inefficiencies in the layers, and it could be that the voltage going through is too high, or the current that's running through is too much, or
And there's
it's
always
running
going to be some heat generated.
right. It says, and one of the interesting things that the neodymium magnets, that they only remain magnetic up to a certain temperature, and the temperature is 85 degrees Celsius, and that they won't have any problem. And they start to demagnetize above 150 degrees, which I thought was interesting. So you're sitting there going, "Oh, I should be able to, it's no big deal if I heat up the motor, right?" It's like, well, it could be, because if you demagnetize your magnets, you're
You're
pretty
not
much
going anywhere.
you ruined your motor. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, and so typically outside, you're never really going to reach much over 70 degrees if the motor's running like it should. Um,
Hmm.
actually, after a motor's run, the recommendation is that you should be able to touch the motor casing with a fingertip for 2 to 3 seconds without getting burned. And usually, there's almost never any worry about the copper coating. So the wire that's going around the stators, is a coated wire. It looks just copper, but there's a coating on it, and that
Hmm.
coating doesn't degrade until the heat is 210 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So you're going to have your magnets demagnetized before the copper coating goes. So keep that in mind. Whenever it's like, oh, it's a copper coating, it's ruined everything. Like, oh, chances are no. And one of the other things that I thought was interesting, and I hope I described this accurately, it's the number. Sometimes motors are, some of the older motors, especially when you're looking at RC car motors, this is how they've been done for a long time, is they're described as the number of turns. Right? Oh, I got a 13 turn motor. It's amazing, right? And so you'll see
Right.
that set of numbers, which may or may not make any sense, and then there'll be a hyphen or a space or a dash or something, and they'll say 13T, and that's referring to 13 turns. And that basically is saying that there are 13 turns around each stator before the wire is done for each phase,
Okay.
which means that's that much. So what happens is the smaller number of turns means it has a higher torque. So lower T, higher torque. It's more efficient because there's less wire, there's less resistance. Because the electricity going through the wire is still generating the field. And so when you have a higher turn motor, it's going around a lot more. And what ends up happening is there's more resistance to the flow through the wire, and it reduces the amount of torque. Again, that's what as I understand it, that's how it is. Now, if I'm wrong, please email us, aviationrcnoob@gmail.com. Let me know how I got it wrong, because that's one of those ones I tried to figure it out, and the descriptions were primitive at best.
Yeah.
It just says, well, one's the inverse of the other. And it's like, well, okay, but why? Like, why? And the best thing that I found was that because the wire's longer, there's more resistance.
The only thing I'm seeing, I did a real quick search because I didn't think we were actually going to cover turns because I didn't have any information on it.
I didn't want to if it means much.
Like a real quick reference I'm seeing is fewer turns is higher KV. Don't ask me why.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I get the inverse? Did I get it backwards?
Yeah, you flipped it.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I apologize to you
turns,
and all the listeners.
Fewer turns is higher KV or higher RPM per volt.
Yes.
And higher turn count is lower KV, but assumed to be a higher torque. So
okay, yeah, fewer poles give higher motor RPM. Sorry, I got it backwards.
It's okay. Cannot tell you why that's the case.
Again, the only reason I found was that the amount of resistance. I guess so. The higher, no, that doesn't. I guess the higher turn means that there's more resistance. So the opposite of what I said, because there's less resistance or more resistance because it's longer. It can't achieve the flux fast enough.
Yeah, I mean it could be that the higher turn count is inducing stronger magnetic fields within the stator or armature,
creating a higher torque.
Right, thus a stronger field to act in the magnetic field, but as a side effect of that, the eddy currents are that much stronger, so it's that much harder to overcome them. So the motor doesn't have the response to get up to speed, whereas fewer turns is not inducing as strong a field. So lower torque, but it can run much faster because those fields can flip faster.
It has a higher force, rotational force to pull it, but it can't go as fast.
Right, because it's fighting again. It goes back to
it can't change as fast. Okay, yeah, I got you. Yeah. Yep, that makes sense.
And that's an assumption. If anybody, if you guys happen to know, write in, let us know, because this was a part of the top of this conversation, this topic, that neither one of us actually dug that deep into.
Yeah.
we were looking at the other things. We were like, turns are just magic. So, uh,
Yeah, that's what it seemed like. Okay, so thank you for correcting what I got exactly backwards. So whatever I said, reverse it, and you're good. Um, one other thing I want to add is so as you can tell that anything like this, there's no commu commutator to automatically change the flow direction of the current, right?
mm-hmm,
So it's all done electrically. What happens is the one thing that is a common error is oftentimes you get your speed controller and you get your motors and there's just a bunch of uncapped wires. There's wires with little bare ends that are pre-soldered for your ease, and they send a bunch of bullets. So you've got to solder your bullets onto the end of the wire, and you got to solder the receiver piece on the end of the ESC, and you connect them. You protect them electrically and all that stuff, so they don't
mm-hmm,
short out between. Because if any of the phases connect, it shorts out and comes back in, and now you've basically shorted out your battery effectively, and you're going to burn out your components in the ESC immediately. So don't cross the wires. Um, but more importantly, if that solder connection isn't good, you're you're creating basically a discontinuity in electrical flow. And as the timing is on the order of like picoseconds or nanoseconds or whatever, it's incredibly small portion of a second. If there's a discontinuity in that, what you're doing is now you're throwing off which pole is being activated, and then you're going to have the rotation stop and try to go back to whatever pole is now erroneously activated,
mm-hmm.
and it's going to, but maybe it fixes that short, so everything's running you like it's supposed to, which means now instead of going um 1 2 3, it's going 1 2 3 2 3 1 2 3 2 3, and it's off. And what happens is it'll stutter. So if you see a connection that's bad, if it's stuttering, it most likely means that there's a connection bad. And oftentimes it's soldering. And if it's me, it's most definitely soldering. Because up until recently, I had the worst soldering gun, soldering iron, and I need to go back through all those joints again and just kind of reflow the solder with some flux. But anyway, point is if that's an issue, and that's something you'll commonly see in a motor, you plug it in, you try to get it going, and it goes, it'll stutter back and forth. If it's doing that, it's likely worth going back and reflowing your solder in each of those the wire to the bullet connection.
Okay.
Let's see. I think that's about it. And there's when you get into like crazy um, high-end motors, you're starting to get into things that have sensors. So you're
Mm-hmm.
having a brushed motor that has a sensor, and that sensor talks to the speed controller and tells the speed controller how far ahead or behind the motor is to the timing it's sending out, which means it can then correct for the lag and effectively create an advance so that the motor can appropriately meet what it's trying to do. So it's sending out signals so that the motor can reach a certain speed. But because of the flux and in the plates, in the stator plates, it's going to hesitate a little, right? We talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
So the sensor will detect that there's a gap. It'll measure the gap and it'll send that back to the speed controller. The speed controller will then adjust the timing loop ahead so that it matches what it wants to do, and it adjusts for the lag and makes your motor do the true time because it recognizes that what it's sending out originally was inaccurate and lagging, and thereby
Or
advances the
at
timing.
least inefficient.
Inefficient, right? And then it advances the timing.
So not unlike advancing your distributor or adjusting your distributor cap
Yep.
to and this is older
Yep.
motors, but
It's
Not
okay.
not unlike adjusting the spark plug spark in relation to top dead center on your motor.
Right. To account or adjust for the natural tendency of the components to be slightly off.
Yeah, that I have experience with.
Right. So you're
I have hooked up a timing light to my old Volkswagen.
that's it. That's it. So that's, and I'm not going to get into too much because I don't have any timing censored motors, and I don't have any ESCs that do that either. That's when I mean, when you start getting into the giant class stuff where it's like a 10-foot plane, and that's the average wing size.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now you're starting to get into motors that need to adjust for that timing, and the the plane itself, the overall cost put into the motor and into the components and into the actual aircraft itself starts warranting that extra safety factor
Mm-hmm.
where it's worth getting that extra little boost in performance. So, and again, that's something I don't know anything about because I am all about the foamies. And if it's a 10-inch, if it's a 10-foot wingspan, it's because it's still only 2 pounds, and I'm running it on some ridiculously small motor that it shouldn't even work with. So, um, yeah, so that's what I've got. I know I didn't really cover the components too much, but the components are almost in many ways identical to brushed motors. They're just arranged essentially opposite.
Yeah.
And the
Um.
only difference is that there's no physical connection
Mm-hmm.
uh, for electric transfer to power the coils that generate the electric field, the magnetic fields. That's the big difference. And that all that kind of stuff, instead of happening in the motor almost automatically, it it gets pushed out to electronic components bef- that control the power that goes to the motor and where, what coil.
Right. Okay.
Whew,
Um. Yeah.
I think we
Whew,
made it.
boy.
I
That
think
was that was a big one.
yeah,
That was a big one.
yeah.
Obviously, I don't think we're just not going to be able to do ESCs in this episode.
No, that's
Um,
okay.
we don't.
Oh,
It go ahead.
before I go, there's one last thing. Um,
Okay.
One of the things that remember, power or is measured in watts. Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
watts is basically the voltage, so the energy coming from the battery times the amount how fast it comes out, which is the amperage or the flow. And um, so typically most motors that we use in these little foamies are maybe a 3-cell LiPo, so that's around 10, 11 volts times, and they're typically run 25 amps, right? We use a 30 amp ESC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's its capacity. But we never really want to run it to that because if it does, it's likely to burn out the components, and then you're in trouble. You have a plane with nothing powering it. So what you have is you want to run a little bit underneath. So now you've got 10 volts, 25 amps. You have a 250 watt motor. Okay. So
Okay.
what does that mean to me? And so if you're an old head and you've been doing this for a while, almost all the motors were rated in watts or horsepower, which they quickly converted to watts, depending on if you're using nitros or electric back in the day. What you're trying to do is find something that made sense. So a lot of
Right.
the people say that there's a guide to choosing the motor size based on the kind of plane you want. The rough guide is you want 100 watts per pound, okay, for a rough, like kind of a sport flying experience. So what if you have a 250 watt motor, what you're going to have is it'll pretty much pull a 2.5 pound plane around the air.
Okay.
And then some of the other guides, and we'll post this little guide image here. And it's basically if you have a glider or you're doing a slow flyer, it's going to be 30 to 60 watts. And that's maybe like a biplane. It's real simple and super light. So 30 to 60 watts per pound. Trainer planes and basic scaling flying is 60 to 75 watts per pound. So that would be like a 4-pound trainer. 250 watt setup would do. Or maybe some scale flying, like if you have a warbird maybe. Sport flying. So that's where you're going to start doing acrobatics, and you're going to want to be able to do a full throttle climb out or something like that, or improved climbing because it's a little bit sluggish. That's going to be 75 to 100 watts per pound. So as you can see, like as the power level goes up, you're going to be able to do far more stuff with it. Next is limited 3D performance, where you're basically hovering in the craft right in the air. So your thrust has to be equal to the amount of weight if you want to do a hover, right? And then of course you want a little bit more because you want to be able to pull out of that in case something goes wrong. And you want enough of it where you can get out quick. So so they recommend 100 to 150 watts per pound. So again, and then last, if you're doing full 3D and tons of pattern acrobatics, that's 150 to 200. So we're looking at almost 4 times the amount you would use in a trainer, maybe, or 3.5 to do 3D flying.
So it's your motor choice is a mixture of the plane you're planning to fly and how you're planning to fly it.
Exactly.
Okay.
If you're flying flight test stuff, or even if you're not, if you're flying ready to fly stuff, or you have a kit, one of the things you're going to see the size of the plane itself. It'll have a wingspan, right? And part of it, it'll say running on a certain size prop. Like it'll say use an 8-inch prop or a 10-inch prop or a certain size fan or something. When you're buying that kit, look at the size of the propeller. It'll also recommend probably a wattage for the motor, and then kind of look at those when you're looking at the motor that you're going to buy for that kit. Keep those values in mind. The aimed wattage you're aiming for and the propeller you're going to use, and make sure that your motor will match those. Remember, if you overpower the motor, you're basically going to run it incredibly efficiently if you're running it too low. Most motors run most efficiently at about 75 to 80% throttle. And you can look at some of the motors that'll have like whole throttle curves. They have like on a 3-cell thing with a 5-inch propeller with a 4-inch, what is that? The bite. What did I say it was? Oh my God, I'm blanking. The pitch, thank you. A 5x4 prop, it'll say, hey, at 10%, you're going to pull 10 amps. At 30% throttle, you're going to pull 15. And it'll go through the throttle range, and it'll just tell you how many amps you're pulling. It'll give you a bench-tested thrust, which isn't so static. It'll be a static thrust. It means that nothing's moving. It's going to be pulling with this much force, right? Which you can use to figure out kind of how your plane, what kind of flying capacity you want your plane to be. Most planes run at like almost a 1-to-1 or a 1.5-to-1. So your thrust should be about as much as your plane weighs, if not a little bit more. But depending, maybe you have a glider, you don't need as much.
Right.
Anyway, you're going to look at those throttle curves, and you'll see that, and then it'll have basically the amount of thrust per gram of motor or per amperage, and it's basically a measure of efficiency. And you'll see that the maximum efficiency on most motors is somewhere around 70 to 80% throttle.
Okay.
So oversizing a motor because you think I'm going to do it, it's going to be great. What happens is you have your throttle much lower, and it's not as efficient, which means you're burning through battery faster than you could.
Okay.
Like you're using more watts than you initially have to.
Right, because you're running your throttle low, which is not its efficiency point.
Right.
So you're burning more current than you really need to be for flying at that speed.
Exactly.
I got you.
Yep.
Okay.
That's it. Okay, I think that covered everything.
Okay. Cut the motor conversation there. That was that's a lot to go over.
It is. I don't. Yes, and we have a lot. And I feel like the ESC talk is less, but it's just as detailed. There's a lot of background in it because you have to
Yeah,
talk about protocols and sort of. And the reason why you have to talk about it is because when you're buying an ESC, okay, well this one says it's Simon K. This one is BL Heli. This one is BL Heli S. This one is BL Heli S D Shot 1500. I just want a 30 amp motor. But all that, like we don't need it. But at the same point, when you're purchasing a speed controller, it's helpful to know what that is, so you know not to get it if that's not what you want.
all right. So with all that covered, and that was a lot, guys. For anyone who's still with us and still tuned in and still listening, thank you.
Thank you.
Um,
I agree.
it was a long haul for us too. We appreciate you hanging out with us, and if you have questions, about anything that we covered, feel free to write us in or write into us, aviationrcnoob@gmail.com. You know,
Yeah.
we'll be happy to answer what
Oh,
we can.
okay.
Go
Hey,
ahead, Matthew.
that reminds me of something. I don't know if you're going to get to it. I probably should have just been patient. Um, hey, I remember early on we kind of said, hey, if you send an email in, um, let us know if you want us to use it on the air. And I know we've been talking about possibly changing that default.
Right. So some of the feedback that we received, and it was sort of a one-on-one conversation through email that I was having uh, with someone, was perhaps we should change that policy such that you know we can more willingly or more readily answer questions in these podcasts without somebody having to specifically say. And then if somebody doesn't want something they write in read on the air, or we say that might be a little too personal to that, maybe they don't want that on the air. But at this point, we'll flip the policy on that one, and at the beginning of our next episode, we'll discuss it again briefly. If you write in, write in a question, we may answer it in the next episode. Feel free to. And,
Right in. You might be on the air with us.
Yeah, provide feedback. Let us know your thoughts. This is certainly, I'd have to think, but I'm pretty sure this is our longest episode so far.
Yes.
And there was a lot of stuff to dig into. Matthew, I know that you had received feedback as we were still coming up with a concept for this and what topics we wanted to cover in some of the early episodes. Guys you were talking with on the side was go in as deep as you can go. All right.
Right.
Well,
They said go as far as you're comfortable going. And I felt what they were getting at, because when I was new getting into this, I'll tell you what, my favorite episodes of any podcast to listen to were the guys going so deep into the technical stuff. I was stretching my brain and having to ask my electrical engineer coworkers, what the heck are they talking about?
right.
Because I wanted to know. Like I felt this is super important to me understanding how to be, I guess, fluent in the hobby, and
Mm-hmm.
to really just have a lot of fun with it, instead of being, let me buy a plane and see if I can fly it. It goes to, ooh, I have a great idea. I want to turn into a flying plane, and having the knowledge behind it to be able to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. And we said this podcast, we hope, would be the documentation of our journeys. And part of that journey is learning. I learned a lot just prepping for this episode. So
You did a great job too. Thank you.
well, as did you. Thank you. So yeah, feel free to write us. Let us know your thoughts. Was it too long? Was it too deep? What are your thoughts? If you're even still listening with us at this point, hope you are, and if you are, thank you. But yeah, we've got more topics on the list that we're going to be getting into in the near future. ESCs are next, as I recall.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and
batteries. This episode.
Yep, batteries. If we can muster some knowledge together for that, that is by far, to me, a dangerous topic, yet an incredibly important one. And by dangerous, I mean I don't want to mislead anybody
Yeah.
at all, because it's lipos are incredibly safe in general. The problem is if they go wrong, they can go wrong enough to burn your house down.
Yeah.
It does, again, it's really rare, but at the same point, if you're not taking the right precautions, and I tell you the wrong thing or Joe tells you the wrong thing, I don't, I definitely don't want you to be at risk.
Mhm.
So it's really important that while we're doing that part, we're getting it right. But the sooner you know about it, the safer you can be. So um, I'm excited to get into it.
And if you ever hear us, bring us some information that's false or not completely accurate, let us know. We can correct it in the next episode before we get into all the good stuff.
Or
But
just let us know how we're doing. We'd love to hear it.
yep,
It's certainly encouraging. Thank you.
it is. And with that, Matthew, let's go ahead and wrap it up. I think we covered all the personal things we needed to on the front end of this episode. So why don't you
Okay,
give us your closing thoughts?
absolutely. My closing thoughts are if you don't remember the email, it's aviationrcnoob@gmail.com. My name is Matt. I love this hobby. And remember, if you're not laughing and having fun, you might be doing it wrong.
Very well. All right, guys, take care.
Take care.